Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Pull up something comfortable, maybe a blanket, maybe a cool drink within reach, because tonight we're going somewhere that does not feel gentle at first. We're going into heat, into dust, into roads that were barely roads at all, into a war that is usually remembered through battles, generals, maps and treaties, but that was also fought mile by men whose worst enemy was sometimes not standing across a field with a musket. Sometimes the worst enemy was the sun overhead, the canteen running dry, the mule that could no longer stand, and the next stretch of ground that seemed to promise water but gave nothing back. Tonight, we're talking about why desert marches during the Mexican-American War were so deadly. And before we settle into it, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you somewhere warm, somewhere cold, somewhere with the window open, somewhere with the room dark except for the small glow of a screen? And while you sit there, think for a moment about the hottest walk you have ever taken. Maybe across a parking lot in July. Maybe along a beach with sand that burned through your shoes. Maybe a hike where you misjudged how much water you needed, and suddenly every step became more irritating than the last. Hold that small memory in your mind for a moment, because what happened to soldiers in the deserts of the southwest and northern Mexico during the 1840s was that feeling enlarged beyond anything most of us have ever had to endure. It was heat without relief, thirst without a faucet nearby, distance without a road sign, and exhaustion under military orders that did not pause simply because the body had begun to fail. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, it would mean a lot if you hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. You do not have to do it now. Do it when something in the story settles in, when some detail surprises you, or when you catch yourself thinking about how strange it is that so much of history turns on things as basic as water, shade, and whether a man's boots still fit by the end of the day. Now let us begin. When most people picture the Mexican-American War, they tend to picture the dramatic parts, the thunder of artillery at Palo Alto, the street fighting in Monterrey, the assault on Chapultepec, the march into Mexico City. These were real. They mattered. They shaped the war, but they do not tell the whole story. The war stretched across an enormous geography, from the lower Rio Grande to New Mexico, from the high plains to California, from northern Mexico to the Valley of Mexico. Armies did not simply appear at battlefields. They had to get there. They had to drag food, powder, medical supplies, wagons, artillery, horses, mules, and exhausted human beings across distances that often looked manageable on a map and became punishing once boots touched the ground. That is the first thing worth understanding. A desert march was not merely travel between battles. It was an event in itself. It could weaken an army before a single shot was fired. It could reduce the number of men who reached the objective. It could destroy animals, wreck supply plans, and turn healthy recruits into patients lying in the back of wagons. During the war, American commanders and Mexican commanders alike had to move forces across regions where water was scarce. Forage for animals was unreliable, and reliable geographic knowledge was often thinner than confidence. The US Army's own medical history later observed that it had devoted surprisingly little effort before the campaign to gathering information about Mexico's geography, water supplies, and other practical conditions that would matter once armies began moving. That shortcoming was not a small administrative error. In desert country, a poor understanding of water could mean death. There is a tendency to think of war as an argument between armed men. One side decides to fight, the other side resists. Then historians count casualties and move on. But a 19th century army was an organism with thousands of fragile parts. Men needed water several times a day in hard heat. Horses needed more. Mules pulling wagons needed enough strength to keep the supply train moving. Oxen could not be treated like machines and expected to continue indefinitely. Powder had to stay dry. Food had to remain edible. Boots had to hold together. Wounds had to be treated. Fever had to be contained. and if the column reached a barren stretch too slowly, or consumed its water too quickly, or found that a supposed spring had failed, the entire march could begin to unravel. This is why the desert mattered so much. It did not attack dramatically. It did not charge. It simply waited. It offered a long horizon and gave the impression that the next rise might solve the problem. Maybe there would be a creek. Maybe there would be grass. Maybe the guide was right. Maybe the men could keep moving until evening. The trouble was that when desert travel went badly, it often did not reveal itself all at once. A march might begin in order. Officers riding along the column, wagons creaking, men joking early in the day because joking costs nothing when the canteens are still full. Then the sun climbs higher. The ground reflects heat back upward. Dust begins to coat the tongue. The water in the canteen warms until it no longer feels refreshing, only necessary. The horse starts stumbling. Someone falls behind. A wagon wheel bites into soft soil and must be forced free while the rest of the column waits in the glare. By late afternoon, the strongest men are quieter. The weaker men are no longer pretending. By evening, the question is not how far they marched. It is what the march took from them. One of the clearest examples came with Stephen W. Kearny's Army of the West. In June 1846, Kearny left Fort Leavenworth with a force of roughly 1,660 men and moved toward Santa Fe. The movement was strategically bold, and in the end Santa Fe fell without a fight. But before that peaceful occupation, there was the march itself. The first leg of Kearny's journey covered about 900 miles in roughly 50 days through wilderness, desert and mountains. By early July, many of his soldiers were already described as sick, lame and exhausted, with some too worn down to continue under their own power. Wagons that had been meant for supplies began carrying incapacitated men instead. That detail matters. The battle had not yet come. The army had not yet faced decisive resistance. The road alone was already inflicting casualties, and Kearny was not finished. After entering Santa Fe, he pushed west toward California with a much smaller mounted force. By the time his dragoons encountered California lancers near San Pasqual in December 1846, the men had already endured a punishing overland trek. The National Park Service account notes that Kearny's troops were exhausted from their arduous march when they went into that fight in rainy conditions, with weapons made unreliable by wet powder. The battle itself was deadly, but the march had helped shape the condition in which the men arrived. It is easier to imagine a battle as an isolated event. It is more accurate to see that battle as the final strain placed on bodies that had already been worn down by distance. The Mexican side knew this cruelty too. In February 1847, Santa Anna moved a large army north toward Buena Vista. More than 15,000 men completed a 280-mile march to La Angostura, and the final 50 miles were through a waterless desert. Army histories describe those troops as physically taxed even before the battle began. Think about that. More than 15,000 men, not stepping from a fresh camp into combat, but arriving after a march that had already stripped away strength. The men who stood opposite Taylor's army at Buena Vista did not come there untouched. They came after being driven through heat, hunger, and thirst by the demands of command. This is important because desert marches did not belong to only one army, one nationality or one side of the war. They punished whoever had to cross them. American volunteers suffered, regulars suffered, Mexican infantry suffered, cavalry horses suffered, teamsters suffered, camp followers suffered. The desert did not ask what flag a man marched beneath. It asked whether he had enough water to finish the day. There is a place in New Mexico called the Jornada del Muerto, the journey of the dead man. It was not created by the Mexican-American War, and it was feared long before that conflict began. But it helps us understand the sort of landscape people in the Southwest already knew could kill. The National Park Service describes it as a desolate 90-mile stretch, where no water or forage was available to travellers. 90 miles without dependable water. 90 miles with animals consuming strength at every step. 90 miles where a delay could become a disaster. It was one of those routes whose name was not ornamental, it was descriptive. In desert regions like this, people learned quickly that the difference between a difficult march and a fatal one could be as small as a missed water source or a mistaken estimate of distance. That is the world we are entering tonight, not a war seen from a general's desk. Not a war reduced to arrows on a map. We're going to stay with the men who had to move through the country itself. We're going to watch what happened to an army when the heat rose. We're going to talk about water and why lack of it could destroy discipline faster than fear. We're going to look at wagons, mules, rations, boots, camp disease, bad planning, misleading distances, and the cruel way a march could weaken men before an enemy ever appeared. We're going to see how desert travel turned movement into a test of endurance, and how armies that looked strong at departure could arrive at their destination already damaged. Because the central misunderstanding is this. People often assume men died in war because someone killed them, and of course many did. But in the Mexican-American War, as in so many 19th century conflicts, the environment did part of the killing. Disease did part of it. Exposure did part of it. Lack of water did part of it. Fatigue did part of it. The desert march was dangerous precisely because no single problem had to be overwhelming on its own. A little too much heat, a little too little water, a little less sleep, a blister that became infected, a mule train slowed by sand, a guide uncertain about the next spring. Add those things together across day after day, and the human body begins to lose the argument. Imagine a young volunteer, perhaps from Missouri, perhaps from Tennessee, perhaps from some green part of the country where summer heat was familiar but desert emptiness was not. He signed up with ideas about battle, patriotism, adventure, maybe pay, maybe land, maybe simply the restlessness that sends young men toward uniforms in every era. He pictured muskets. He pictured banners. He might even have pictured glory. What he probably did not picture was the taste of dust mixed with warm water. He did not picture trying to sleep after a day when the ground still held heat after sunset. He did not picture seeing a comrade too weak to carry his pack. He did not picture animals staggering beside the road. He did not picture officers arguing over distance to the next river, while the men listened and understood that no one knew with certainty. And yet, that became part of the war. Not an aside, not a footnote, part of the war. There is a reason military historians pay such close attention to logistics, even though logistics rarely receive the dramatic treatment that battles do. The march decides what kind of army reaches the fight. It decides whether men arrive alert or dulled, whether horses arrive mountable or half-ruined, whether wagons carry ammunition or feverish soldiers, whether an attack is launched from strength or from desperation. Desert campaigns made these questions urgent because there was so little margin for error. In a wooded country, a stream might appear beyond the next ridge. In farming country, forage might be found in fields and barns. In desert country, if the planned water failed, there might be no useful alternative at all. That is why one of the most dangerous illusions in military history is the clean line drawn across a map. The line is smooth. The ground was not. The line moves easily. Men did not. The line reaches Santa Fe. Kearny's soldiers reached it sick, lame, and exhausted. The line bends toward California. His dragoons arrived worn down before combat. The line descends toward Buena Vista. Santa Anna's troops reached the battlefield after a brutal march through country that had already taken strength from them. And still the marching continued, because war demanded movement. Orders arrived. Objectives had to be taken. Reinforcements had to be brought forward. Territory had to be occupied. A general might write that a force must press on, but the body heard that order differently. The body heard it in cracked lips, sore feet, swollen joints, and a heart beating harder than it should. The horse heard it in a dry mouth and collapsing muscle. The wagon heard it in an axle under strain. Every part of a desert column had a limit. The problem was that armies often learned where that limit was only after crossing it. So tonight we begin with that simple, uncomfortable truth. During the Mexican-American War, desert marches were deadly because they turned every ordinary need into a military emergency. Water became strategy, shade became medicine, distance became attrition, heat became an enemy that commanders could not negotiate with and soldiers could not shoot. To understand these marches, we have to stop imagining the desert as empty. It was full of consequences. Let us move now to the first major reason these marches became so punishing. The armies were entering landscapes that gave them almost nothing easily. Very little water, not enough forage, long stretches where supply wagons moved slowly and men had to keep pace anyway. The desert did not need to defeat an army in a single blow. It only needed to make every mile cost more than the men expected. The first hard truth about desert campaigning in the Mexican-American War is that the land did not need to be empty to be unforgiving. It only needed to offer less than an army required, less water than the men could drink, less grass than the horses and mules could eat, fewer settlements than the supply officers hoped to find, longer gaps between reliable stopping places than a wagon train could comfortably manage. That was enough. An army could march into a region that had trails, villages, ranches, river crossings, even a history of travel stretching back generations, and still discover very quickly that it had entered a place that could not support thousands of soldiers moving all at once. The problem was not that nobody had ever crossed these routes before. The problem was that an army was not a trading party, not a family caravan, not a handful of riders moving lightly through the country. An army ate the road beneath it. It drank the water ahead of it. It required more from the landscape in a single day than many isolated settlements were prepared to give in a week. This is easy to miss when we look at a map. A line from Fort Leavenworth to Santa Fe, another from Santa Fe toward California, another running north through Mexico toward Buena Vista. The lines appear clean, decisive, almost simple. They make it look as though commanders chose a route, issued an order, and the army travelled along it until the next important event happened. But a 19th century march was never just movement. It was a daily negotiation with the ground. Could the wagons pass? Would the animals find forage? Was there enough water at the next stop for men, horses, mules, and cattle? Would a stream marked by travellers from another season still be running now? Was a spring actually where the guide believed it was? Were there farms nearby from which grain or livestock could be purchased, seized, or bargained for? When those questions had bad answers, an army did not simply become uncomfortable. It became weaker. When Stephen W. Kearny's Army of the West set out from Fort Leavenworth in June 1846, it moved toward New Mexico along the Santa Fe Trail, one of the most important overland routes in North America. This was not an unknown road. Traders had used it for decades. Mexican merchants, American merchants, wagon trains, military escorts, and indigenous communities all understood that the trail connected Missouri to Santa Fe and the northern provinces of Mexico. Yet familiarity did not make the route gentle. According to the National Park Service, the mountain route from Independence to Santa Fe measured about 844 miles, and Kearny's force left Fort Leavenworth only a month after Congress declared war. He was not leading a light scouting party. He was moving a military expedition with hundreds of wagons, cavalry, artillery, supplies, and more than 1,000 men into a region where the distances alone were severe. By the time Kearny's army approached Santa Fe, the march had already proven that distance was not a neutral thing. The Army medical history later described the first leg of his journey as a 50-day, 900-mile ordeal through wilderness, desert, and mountains. By early July, many men were already sick, lame, and exhausted. Some were too worn down to continue under their own power. Wagons meant to carry the tools of conquest became ambulances for men defeated by the road before reaching a battlefield. The Mexicans did not have to oppose Kearny in order for his force to suffer. The combination of poor diet, difficult water, intense heat, fatigue, and disease, began the work on its own. That is one of the most important things to understand about these marches. An army could be winning strategically while losing strength every day. Now picture what such a march looked like from the ground. At first light, men rose from thin sleep. There was no guarantee of comfort in camp. Some slept in tents, some under rough shelter, some with very little between themselves and the dirt. The animals had to be gathered and harnessed. Wagons had to be checked. Officers had to decide whether the column could make the next water source before nightfall. Men chewed what breakfast they had, drank what water they were allowed, adjusted straps, lifted muskets, and began walking again. The wagons groaned into motion. Wheels bumped over rough ground. Harness leather creaked. Mules kicked dust into the faces of the soldiers marching behind them. The road did not need to be steep to be exhausting. It only needed to be long, dry, and repetitive. A man can endure discomfort when he believes it will end soon. Desert marching punished him by making every horizon look like the one before it. And the army had to keep moving because stopping was not always safer. A camp required water. It required forage. It required enough open ground to place men, animals, wagons and sentries in some kind of order. If a commander halted too early in the wrong place, the column might save energy for the moment and create a worse problem by morning. If he pushed too far, men might stagger into camp barely able to stand. This created a cruel kind of arithmetic. Every route through dry country was measured not merely in miles, but in the distance between usable resources. A place 10 miles away with water might matter more than a place 5 miles away without it. A river bend could determine the day's entire schedule. A cluster of springs could decide where a whole army slept. This is why experienced travellers studied stopping places so carefully, and why their names enter the geography of movement. Along the Camino Real, for example, travellers relied on parajes, rest stops where they might water animals, gather themselves, and prepare for what came next. Before the Jornada del Muerto, Paraje San Diego was valued precisely because it was the final dependable chance to water stock before entering the dry stretch ahead. The Jornada del Muerto deserves our attention here, not because every soldier in the Mexican-American War crossed that exact path, but because it shows the kind of country military columns had to think about in the Southwest. The National Park Service describes it as a dreaded 90-mile waterless shortcut that bypassed a longer bend of the Rio Grande. Following the river offered water but also difficult terrain, including canyons, arroyos and quicksand. The shorter route cut across desolate ground with no reliable water along the way. That is the choice desert travel often presented. Longer and difficult, or shorter and dangerous. Slow misery or quicker risk. The Jornada had been feared long before the war, and accounts of earlier travellers already showed how quickly scarcity became life-threatening. One expedition in the 17th century saw its water nearly vanish before rain pools saved the party. During the 1680 Pueblo Revolt, a refugee column crossing the same desert suffered catastrophic losses. The land had a reputation because people had learned what happened there. A military column could not treat such country casually. Men were one problem, animals were another. Horses and mules were not extra equipment. They were the movement of the army itself. Cavalry depended on them. Artillery depended on them. Wagons depended on them. If animals failed, supplies stopped moving. If supplies stopped moving, the army's condition deteriorated rapidly. But grazing in arid country was uncertain, and feed carried in wagons took up space that might otherwise hold ammunition, food, or medical stores. The land did not merely make marching difficult, it forced commanders to choose what kinds of weakness they were willing to risk. Carry more grain for the animals and reduce room for something else. Carry less and hope to find forage. Push ahead quickly and save supplies, but wear out men and beasts. Move more cautiously and preserve strength, but consume more food before reaching the objective. None of these choices were clean. This was true for American forces and it was true for Mexican forces. When Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna marched north toward Buena Vista in early 1847, he led a much larger army into equally punishing conditions. An official US Army history states that more than 15,000 Mexican soldiers completed a 280-mile march to La Angostura, with the last 50 miles passing through a waterless desert. The same account notes that the army suffered from inadequate wagons, starvation rations, and terrain too barren to support its needs. By the time Santa Anna's troops neared the American position, they were already physically taxed. That does not mean they lacked courage. It means they had spent courage simply getting there. They had marched their bodies through a landscape that could not sustain them. There is a detail from that movement that says more than a general summary ever could. On February 21st, Santa Anna ordered a forced march north from Encarnacion toward Agua Nueva. His soldiers carried full canteens and 3 days' rations, but the march covered roughly 23 miles over waterless ground. The army history says they were pushed to the brink of collapse and dragged themselves into camp by nightfall. Then, fearing discovery by American patrols, they spent a bitterly cold night without fires before rising again before dawn to continue toward La Angostura. This is what it meant to bring an army through a land that offered almost nothing. The hardship did not pause after sunset. Heat drained men by day. Cold punished them by night. Hunger sharpened fatigue. Silence in camp was ordered not because anyone felt restful, but because tactical concealment mattered more than comfort. It is worth pausing on that contrast between day and night. We often talk about deserts as if they are simply hot, but soldiers learned that arid country could shift brutally. The same ground that baked under the sun could chill after dark. A man exhausted from walking might lie down without proper warmth and wake shivering. A unit deprived of campfires because secrecy mattered could lose the small relief that heat and cooked food would have offered. The environment took its toll in layers. There was rarely one dramatic instant when the march became deadly. More often, it accumulated. A poor meal, a missed sleep, a long water gap, dust inhaled hour after hour, a musket carried when the shoulders already hurt, a cold night after a draining day, then the same again tomorrow. When officers later described men as worn, taxed, sick or exhausted, those words contained whole days of suffering, and still, from the outside, the country could appear almost peaceful. That may be the most deceptive part. A broad plain, low hills, open sky, no cannon fire, no enemy in view, a landscape that looked empty enough to be harmless. But emptiness was not harmless. It meant no barn full of hay, no shaded village every few miles, no certain well waiting just ahead, no ready market from which an army could quickly purchase what it lacked. In fertile regions, the land might resist occupation politically, while still providing food, fuel, and shelter. Desert and semi-desert regions resisted logistically. They offered fewer mistakes a commander could afford to make. This helps explain why trails mattered so much. The Santa Fe Trail was not just a path on the ground. It was the difference between organized movement and wandering. The Camino Real was not just an old colonial road. It connected a chain of known stopping places through difficult country. Roads of this kind did not eliminate hardship, but they gave travellers a pattern. Armies depended on that pattern. They moved from known water to known water when they could. They followed routes where others had passed because previous travellers had already paid for some of the knowledge in sweat, panic, and sometimes death. Yet even those established routes could strain under the weight of military movement. A commercial caravan might preserve itself through flexibility. A general with orders to seize a territory or meet an enemy had less room to improvise. There is also the question of scale, and scale changes everything. One traveller nearing a spring is relieved to find water. 1,000 soldiers reaching the same spring may discover that it cannot satisfy them all quickly. Add animals, cooking needs, and refill requirements for the next day, and a useful water source becomes a scene of delay and tension. Men wait in line, animals push forward, officers try to maintain order, those at the rear worry whether enough will remain. The source may recover naturally over time, but an army has no interest in waiting days for water to return to a seep or pool. It must move according to operational demands, not according to the patience of geology. This is how a resource that was perfectly adequate for ordinary travel became inadequate for war. The same problem applied to food. A few riders could buy or barter for enough corn, beans, or meat from a settlement. A marching army required quantities that might strip a region bare. This mattered especially in northern Mexico and New Mexico, where communities already balanced their own needs against limited local production. Armies arriving hungry were not just customers, they were pressure. Their presence could disrupt local supplies, strain relations with civilians, and still fail to provide enough food for the soldiers themselves. Santa Anna's army showed the consequence on one side of the war. Kearny's column demonstrated it on the other. One marched into New Mexico under supply strain and watched illness spread. The other moved north on starvation rations through country unable to feed it. In both cases, the land set hard limits on military ambition, and beneath all of this sat a planning problem. Armies entering such regions needed accurate information, but the information available was not always complete, consistent, or suited to the scale of military operations. Traders knew routes, local residents knew routes, indigenous communities knew routes, scouts and guides knew routes. But the army did not always possess that knowledge in a systematic form before moving. The official medical history of the war observed that inadequate preparation and poor geographical understanding complicated the campaign, especially where practical questions of water and movement were concerned. That deficiency may sound bureaucratic. In the desert, it was physical. If a commander guessed wrong about the next water, the men paid for the mistake with their bodies. This is why desert marches during the war so often became arguments between military schedules and environmental reality. Orders might demand speed. The road demanded caution. Commanders might want surprise. Animals needed rest. A general might believe that pressing forward would bring victory. The men in the column might know only that their lips were cracking and that the dust was turning their throats raw. Neither side of that tension was imaginary. Armies do sometimes have to move quickly. Santa Anna's march toward Buena Vista was meant to bring decisive force against Taylor before circumstances changed. Kearny's movement into New Mexico was central to American plans in the West. But the landscape made every operation expensive. Success could still arrive, yet it arrived carrying hidden costs. When we say that armies marched into a land that offered almost nothing, we do not mean the land was worthless or vacant. That would be false, and it would erase the people who lived there, travelled there, traded there, and understood it far better than most invading soldiers ever could. What we mean is that the land offered almost nothing in the quantities and timing a 19th century army demanded. It did not deliver water on command. It did not provide forage at military scale. It did not shorten distances because a general was impatient. It did not soften because men were young or patriotic or far from home. The desert gave what it had, when it had it, where it had it. Those who failed to respect that fact suffered quickly. Those who did respect it still suffered, just with slightly better odds. So before heat stroke, before the blisters split open, before the canteens emptied and the mouths went dry, there was this more basic danger. The armies were entering country that could not easily carry them. That is what made every march precarious from the beginning. The men stepped onto trails already burdened by expectation. They would cross long stretches between water. They would depend on animals that could fail. They would ask small settlements to support large columns. They would trust maps, guides, and memory in places where a mistake did not remain a mistake for long. And over all of it hung the same question, repeated each morning before the column moved out again. Was there enough ahead of them to keep going? The next thing to understand is what happened once the sun rose higher and the body itself began to lose the contest. Because the desert did not need to deny an army all water at once. Sometimes it only needed to make every mile hotter than the last. At first, the heat did not announce itself as a crisis. It arrived in the ordinary way. The morning opened pale and dry. Men rose from camp before the worst of the day, because everyone understood that the early hours were kinder than the afternoon. Boots were tightened, belts were adjusted, muskets were lifted, canteens were checked by habit, even when there was not much inside them. The column began to move, and for a while it looked manageable. A man could tell himself that the air was warm but not unbearable, that the march would be steady, that the next halt would come soon enough. The trouble was that desert heat rarely needed to overwhelm a soldier at the beginning of the day. It had all the time it needed. It could wait until the sun stood higher, until the air stopped moving, until the road whitened underfoot and the men had already spent too much strength to turn back from the day's objective. That was when the march changed. That was when heat stopped being weather and became a force acting on every body in the line. A battlefield announces itself. Men hear guns, they see smoke. They understand that they are in danger. Heat did not provide that clarity. It worked slowly. It made the mouth dry first. Then the tongue felt thick. The collar rubbed harder against the neck. The shoulders carrying the musket and pack began to ache sooner than they should have. Sweat darkened cloth, then dried away, leaving salt along the fabric. A soldier might not think of himself as ill. He might only think he was tired, then unusually tired, then angry at the pace, then irritated by every small delay. Modern military medicine recognizes a progression in which exertion under heat can lead from cramping and weakness to dizziness, nausea, short-term collapse, and in the worst cases, life-threatening heat stroke. 19th century soldiers did not possess that vocabulary in the way modern doctors do, but they knew what they saw. Men faltered. Men dropped out. Men who had begun the day fit for duty ended it barely able to continue. This matters because the Mexican-American War placed large numbers of soldiers into environments where hard movement and punishing heat overlapped. Kearny's Army of the West crossed enormous distances in 1846 on its way to New Mexico and then farther west. Santa Anna's troops endured brutal movement before Buena Vista, including a final 50-mile stretch through waterless desert. The Mormon Battalion, marching across the southwest toward California, also moved through arid country in a campaign famous not for a major battlefield victory, but for the hardship of its overland route. These were not brief afternoon patrols. They were long operations in which men were expected to sustain effort day after day in landscapes that could drain them before any engagement took place. And the sun was not simply hot, it was constant. In forest country there are interruptions, shade from trees, the damp coolness of a creek bed, a farmhouse wall, a barn, a hedgerow. In the open country of the southwest and northern Mexico, much of that relief vanished. The sky expanded over the march. The men saw where they were going long before they reached it, which often made distance feel crueler rather than easier. A low ridge remained ahead for an hour. A patch of darker ground that seemed close proved still farther off. The road shimmered. The horizon offered shapes that looked useful, and then became nothing once the column approached. Even without dramatizing it, the psychological effect mattered. Heat wore down the body, and the landscape wore down patience. A march feels longer when the eyes cannot find relief. Glare added its own misery. Soldiers moved through pale ground, open skies, dry riverbeds, and stretches of road where the light seemed to come not only from above but from the earth itself. Historical travellers across western desert routes repeatedly treated summer heat as a serious planning problem, and earlier expeditions across the Sonoran region deliberately timed departure to avoid the worst of it. By the 1840s, men who knew the country understood that season mattered. But armies do not always get to choose their season. Campaign plans, military deadlines, political pressure, and the movement of enemy forces can send soldiers forward when the weather is least forgiving. In such conditions, every extra hour under the sun carried a cost. One of the mistakes modern people make is imagining heat as a single sensation, as though a soldier simply felt very warm. That is not what sustained exertion does. Heat changes the march itself. It slows reaction. It makes small choices harder. A man who might normally conserve his water begins sipping too soon because his mouth is uncomfortable. Another tries to be disciplined and drinks too little because he fears running out. One loosens his clothing. Another keeps it tightly ordered out of habit or military expectation. A few begin drifting toward the roadside whenever the column pauses. Someone sits when he should remain standing because his legs no longer feel dependable. Someone else gets back to his feet too quickly and feels the world tilt. The column still appears organised from a distance, but inside it, individual bodies are beginning to negotiate separately with the sun. And that negotiation was never private for long. Armies are collective machines. When enough men slowed, the pace of the whole formation changed. When men fell out, officers had to decide whether to leave them with the train, load them onto wagons, pause the movement, or press ahead. Kearny's march towards Santa Fe showed how quickly the road could produce this problem. The Army medical history records men sick, lame, and exhausted during the advance, with wagons increasingly used to carry those who could not continue under their own strength. This is important because it shows the sun's damage becoming logistical damage. A wagon holding a sick soldier cannot also carry the same amount of food, forage, or equipment. The body collapses first, then the supply system feels it. The heat also changed what waiting meant. On a cool march, a halt may feel like mercy. Men loosen their packs, animals rest. A wheel is repaired. The column gathers itself. In exposed country under a punishing sun, a halt could be a mixed blessing. It stopped movement, but it did not stop heat. Men stood in dust, sometimes with very little shade, while the sun continued pressing down. Animals waited with them. The water source ahead did not come closer because the train had stalled. Delay began to feel dangerous. A stopped column could use up strength almost as surely as a moving one, if it was stopped in the wrong place and at the wrong hour. That is one reason commanders worried so intensely about reaching water, reaching shelter, or reaching camp before the day took too much from the force. Now think about the soldier who was not acclimated to this country. Many American volunteers came from regions where summer could certainly be hot, but desert heat carried a different character. It arrived with severe dryness, with long open distances, with fewer familiar signs of comfort. The body loses water through sweat, and in a dry climate that sweat may vanish from the skin so quickly that the person feels less soaked than he actually is. The absence of dripping sweat can be misleading. Modern military health guidance emphasizes that exertion, dehydration, and heat stress combine dangerously, especially during operations that require sustained physical effort. 19th century soldiers understood the outcome more than the mechanism. They saw men weaken faster than expected. They saw muscles cramp. They saw exhaustion harden into something more serious. There was also the burden of what the soldier wore and carried. Even without assigning every regiment the same exact kit, we know these men were marching in military clothing, with weapons, ammunition, and personal gear, not in light athletic dress designed for hot weather endurance. A soldier did not simply walk through the sun. He walked through it carrying the state's requirements on his back and shoulders. That matters. Heat injury becomes more likely when physical work is intense, and the body struggles to shed heat efficiently. The more effort required to maintain pace, the more the sun gained ground. A march that might have been merely tiring under mild weather became punishing under an exposed sky. It is worth asking yourself something simple here. Have you ever noticed how much more difficult an ordinary task becomes when you are too hot? Reading seems harder. Conversation becomes irritating. A walk feels longer. Hunger changes. Patience narrows. Now imagine being expected to march in formation, maintain equipment, obey orders, stay alert for danger, and do it all while your body is quietly failing at the most basic level of temperature control. That is part of what makes these desert marches so revealing. They show how thin the line can be between discipline and depletion. Soldiers were not weak because heat affected them. They were human, and war demanded that they act as if the body had fewer limits than it actually does. Santa Anna's advance toward Buena Vista is especially useful for understanding this. His army did not simply appear near Taylor's force. It arrived after a hard northern movement marked by limited supplies and an exhausting forced march. Official army history describes troops already physically taxed before battle, with the final advance including a long waterless stretch. This meant the sun was part of the battlefield before the battlefield began. Men who had already endured thirst, hunger and exposure were then expected to fight one of the most important engagements of the campaign. When armies clash under those circumstances, the condition of the troops is not a minor background detail. It helps explain what they can endure, how quickly they tire, and how much reserve remains once combat starts. The same was true in the Western campaigns. Kearny's men, and those attached to his movement, endured long overland travel before reaching California. By the time they fought at San Pasqual in December 1846, the dragoons had already suffered through a grueling march, and the National Park Service notes that they entered the engagement exhausted. Weather in that moment was cold and wet rather than desert hot, but the relevance is direct. A long campaign does not injure the body only under one kind of climate. Heat may weaken men earlier, rain and cold may punish them later. The accumulated toll follows the soldier into the next event. Desert marching set up later vulnerability because it spent strength that could not be fully replaced on command. Heat also blurred the boundary between illness and morale. A soldier who complained of exhaustion might be judged as lagging. Another might hide how poorly he felt because no one wanted to be seen as unable to keep pace. Officers under pressure to maintain movement could interpret weakness as reluctance until the pattern became impossible to deny. This is a recurring military problem, and modern armed forces treat heat illness seriously, in part because deterioration can be rapid and dangerous once it crosses a threshold. In the 1840s, no one had the same system of prevention, cooling and evacuation that later militaries developed. If a man became dangerously overheated on the march, the available response was limited by where the army was, what water it had, and whether wagons were available to carry him. The animals suffered alongside the men, and this mattered because heat did not attack them separately from the campaign. Horses became less reliable under strain. Mules pulling loaded wagons lost strength. Oxen slowed. A single animal failure might look small, but the deeper problem was cumulative. If wagons lagged, men waited longer for food and equipment. If cavalry mounts weakened, scouting range contracted. If artillery teams struggled, weapons moved more slowly. The desert punished anything that depended on muscle, and 19th century armies depended on muscle for nearly everything. This is why the sun must be understood not only as a threat to individual soldiers, but as a threat to the functioning of the entire military column. There is a temptation to imagine that soldiers simply adapted after a few days, that the body toughened, that suffering became routine. Some acclimatization does occur in hot environments, and modern military guidance recognizes that gradual adaptation can reduce risk. But desert campaigns do not always provide a gentle adjustment period. Soldiers may be sent into long marches immediately. They may be underfed, underslept, and unfamiliar with the terrain. They may face heat one day, cold the next, and poor water throughout. Even if the body begins to adapt, the campaign may demand too much too quickly. The Mexican-American War repeatedly placed men in circumstances where endurance was expected, faster than adaptation could reliably occur. One should also remember that not all heat-related decline was dramatic enough to be recorded in official terms. A man did not need to collapse unconscious to become less effective. He only needed to grow slower, less attentive, less steady on his feet. A guard who is dulled by heat notices less. A teamster whose judgment is slipping may mishandle animals. A soldier whose vision swims for a few seconds may stumble on rough ground, injure an ankle, and fall behind for the rest of the march. Small impairments matter in war because they stack. The desert took its toll not only in deaths or obvious casualties, but in reduced capacity. Armies arrived with fewer men at full strength than their original numbers suggested, and because the heat worked slowly, it often left room for self-deception. Commanders could say the men would rest at the next stop. Soldiers could say they could manage another mile. Officers could say the water was close. Everyone had reasons to believe the situation remained under control, especially when stopping carried its own risks. That is part of why heat can be so dangerous in military movement. It lets people postpone admitting that the body is failing. By the time the truth becomes obvious, the column may already be scattered with stragglers, sick men, and animals that cannot recover quickly enough for the next day's demands. This is why the sun became an enemy during the Mexican-American War, even though it had no intention, no strategy, and no flag. It did not make decisions. It simply imposed conditions. Men had to carry more water because of it. They needed more rest because of it. Their animals consumed strength faster because of it. Commanders had less flexibility because of it. Marching times mattered because of it. The shape of a day mattered because of it. If the army began too late, pushed too long, or misjudged the distance to relief, the cost rose. A force could enter the morning looking disciplined and end the afternoon scattered into degrees of exhaustion. By evening, the worst of the brightness faded, but that did not mean the day released its grip. Men reached camp with faces darkened by dust and sweat, feet swollen, uniforms stiff, and tempers reduced to almost nothing. Some drank too fast if water was available. Some ate without appetite. Some simply lay down before caring whether they had found the most comfortable patch of ground. The officers still had their work, reports, pickets, orders for the morning. Animals still needed attention. Wagons still required checking. A soldier who had spent the day enduring heat did not arrive at leisure when the sun dropped. He arrived at the next stage of survival, and if the water supply was poor or the march resumed before he recovered, the body carried that debt forward. The next day began where the last one left off. So when we ask why desert marches were deadly, we cannot treat heat as background scenery. Heat changed judgment. It changed speed. It changed logistics. It changed how much punishment a man could take before he reached the point of failure. It helped turn long roads into casualties and campaigns into tests of endurance more severe than the map suggested. And still, heat by itself was only part of the danger. The sun made men thirsty. It made them desperate for the next water stop. It made every canteen feel more important than it had the hour before. Which brings us to the next problem, and perhaps the most unforgiving one of all. In desert war, water was never merely comfort. It was time, strength, discipline, and life measured out in mouthfuls. The sun made men thirsty, but thirst was not merely a discomfort on these marches. It changed the entire shape of the day. It changed how officers planned, how soldiers walked, how animals were handled, and how far a column could safely go before the road became dangerous. A man can ignore hunger longer than he thinks. He can push through sore feet longer than he wants to. He can even keep marching after a night of poor sleep because duty, pride, and the pressure of moving with everyone else carry him forward. Water is different. Once the mouth goes dry and the body begins asking for relief, almost everything else recedes behind that need. The pack still weighs the same. The musket still drags on the shoulder. The road still stretches out ahead, but the mind returns again and again to one question. When do we drink next? That question followed soldiers through the desert campaigns of the Mexican-American War because water was rarely present in the amount an army wanted, exactly where it wanted it, at the moment it needed it. Armies could plan routes around rivers, springs, settlements, and known watering places, but a plan on paper did not guarantee abundance on the ground. A spring useful to traders or a small caravan could be badly strained by a military column, with hundreds or thousands of men, mounted troops, draft animals, cattle, and wagons. A river crossing might be muddy, slow, or difficult to reach. A supposed water source could be low because of drought or overuse. And if a force had no secure water ahead of it, the march became a gamble whether commanders admitted it or not. This is one reason Stephen W. Kearny's Army of the West chose the mountain route of the Santa Fe Trail in 1846, rather than the shorter Cimarron route. The National Park Service records that the mountain route offered more dependable access to water, and also brought the army toward Bent's Fort, which could serve as a base for operations. The Cimarron route was faster, but it demanded exact knowledge of scarce water supplies. That distinction matters. Military history often rewards speed, and commanders like shorter routes when they are trying to seize territory quickly. But in dry country, the shorter route can become the slower one if men and animals begin failing along it. Kearny's choice shows that even before the army reached New Mexico, water was already shaping its strategy. There is a very practical lesson in that. A road with water is not simply more comfortable than a road without it. It is a different road entirely. It allows animals to keep pulling. It allows soldiers to refill canteens. It allows officers to camp with fewer immediate worries. It gives a column a better chance to maintain order rather than straggling into scattered groups based on who can still keep up. The lack of water does the opposite. It fragments confidence. It turns every delay into something men notice. If a wagon breaks down on a well-watered route, it is a nuisance. If it breaks down when the next reliable water is still many miles away, the same event feels far more serious. The problem is not only the wagon, it is the time being consumed while bodies continue to dry out under the sun. Kearny's campaign took place during a difficult season, and one National Park Service study notes that drought in the southwest in 1846 made the better irrigated mountain route appear more attractive. That small detail helps explain how military planning changed when the landscape itself became less forgiving than usual. Water did not have to disappear completely to become a crisis. It only had to become uncertain. A commander could tolerate hardship if he knew where relief would come. Uncertainty was worse. It encouraged every anxious calculation soldiers made once the march began. Will there be enough when we arrive? Are the officers sure? How much should I drink now? Can I afford to save half of this? A canteen that had seemed like equipment in the morning could feel like the most important object a man owned by afternoon. And those decisions were never made by soldiers alone. Water had to be rationed, guarded, transported, and prioritized. Men naturally thought first of their own thirst, but the army had other claims. Horses needed water, mules needed water, oxen needed water. Without those animals, wagons stopped, artillery slowed, and supplies did not reach the next stage of the campaign. It is easy to sympathize with the thirsty soldier because he can speak, complain, and write home afterward if he survives. The animals could only show distress through slowing, stumbling, refusing, collapsing. Yet their suffering mattered directly to the men. Every exhausted mule increased the burden on the rest of the train. Every failed animal made the column less capable of carrying what it needed to continue. A desert march was not simply soldiers looking for water. It was an entire moving system becoming unstable whenever water fell short. The problem became sharper as armies entered stretches already known for their scarcity. The Santa Fe Trail had routes that travellers discussed in exactly these terms. The mountain route was slower and more difficult in some respects, especially through Rayton Pass, but it offered more dependable water. The Cimarron route was quicker and flatter, but those who used it needed to know where the scarce water points were located. That phrase deserves a moment of attention. not where the rivers were, not where water was common, where the scarce water supplies were located. It tells you that travel across those lands was built around memory and local knowledge. People did not wander casually. They moved from water to water because that was how they stayed alive. An invading army may arrive with drums, uniforms, artillery and official orders, but when it enters a dry region, it becomes subject to the same basic rules as everyone else. This was not merely an American problem. Santa Anna's army suffered one of the clearest examples of water scarcity shaping an entire campaign. In early 1847, more than 20,000 Mexican troops moved north from San Luis Potosí toward Taylor's army. An official US Army history explains that Santa Anna's own earlier decision to have wells destroyed in order to delay an American advance later harmed his soldiers, because his force had to march through the same region with barely enough water to survive. It is a striking case of war plans returning in an unexpected form. The wells had been targeted as a defensive measure. Months later, Mexican troops paid for their absence. Water points in a dry country were not minor conveniences. They were strategic assets, and once removed, they changed what armies could endure. The same history states that Santa Anna's army completed a 280-mile advance to La Angostura, with the last 50 miles passing through a waterless desert. Read that slowly. The last 50 miles. Not the first stage when troops were fresh and still adjusting to the road. The last 50, after weeks of marching and supply strain. By the time those soldiers neared Buena Vista, they had already been forced to make the final approach through a stretch that offered no water. The battle that followed is usually discussed in terms of tactics, artillery, and command decisions, and those matters are important. But before the battle began, thirst had already worked on the Mexican army. The men were physically taxed because the campaign had demanded too much from them before the first major clash. One can imagine the mood in that column without exaggerating it. The canteens are lighter than they were that morning. Some men are saving the last mouthful. Others have already drained theirs and regret it. Officers keep the line moving because there is no useful place to stop. Men look ahead for signs of settlement, vegetation, or any change in the ground that might suggest water nearby. Perhaps a few ask quietly how much farther. Perhaps the answer is given sharply, because the officer is just as tired and knows that repeating uncertainty aloud will not improve morale. The animals slow, the dust rises around boots and hooves, the sun lowers eventually but the absence of water remains. A man can be grateful for evening and still know his body has not received what it needs. There is also a social pressure around thirst that is easy to overlook. Soldiers did not march as isolated individuals. They marched in ranks, watched by comrades and officers. No one wanted to be the first to admit he could not continue. Men likely tried to appear steadier than they felt, especially if they feared being mocked as weak or treated as a burden. That means water shortage could remain hidden within a column until many were in worse condition than commanders understood. The outward form of the army might hold together while the inner condition of the men deteriorated. This is one reason thirst is so dangerous in organised movement. It can build quietly and reveal itself suddenly, not because it appeared suddenly, but because men worked to conceal it for as long as they could. Now think about the camps. Reaching water did not always mean relief arrived neatly. If the source was limited, everyone could not drink at once. Men had to wait. Animals had to be watered, often in some kind of order. Officers had to decide priorities. Should mounted troops water first because their animals are needed for scouting? Should the artillery teams come forward? How do you prevent desperate men from breaking discipline around a small spring or shallow pool? We tend to think of camp as rest, but on a thirsty march, a camp near insufficient water could become tense. The point of arrival was also the beginning of distribution, and distribution could expose the difference between what an army needed and what the country actually supplied. The trail world had already taught travellers how serious this could become. One National Park Service educational description of Middle Spring on the Santa Fe Trail invites readers to imagine men, oxen and mules struggling over scarce, muddy, insect-filled water. That description is not about a specific Mexican-American War Army camp, but it captures the wider reality of movement through that corridor. Scarce water was not always clean water. It was what existed. Those who arrived after others might find it fouled by animals or churned into mud. It might still be worth fighting for because the alternative was worse. That is the practical severity of a water route. The value of a spring is not determined by how pleasant it is. It is determined by whether it allows the march to continue. For soldiers, this meant that drinking was not always satisfying even when water was present. Warm water carried in a canteen for hours is still water, but it does not feel refreshing in the way a cold glass does in a modern kitchen. Muddy water, brackish water, water with a taste of leather or metal from the container, water taken after waiting behind animals, all of it met the body's demand without giving much comfort. That distinction matters because comfort affects morale. A man who drinks deeply from a clear stream feels restored. A man who receives a careful allotment of poor water may only feel less desperate than before. He is not renewed, he is temporarily preserved. The uncertainty of water also affected decision-making from above. A general planning movement through dry country was not choosing only between advance and delay. He was deciding what level of risk the force could bear. Push too slowly and supplies shrink while objectives slip away. Push too quickly and men arrive damaged. Avoid one route because of sparse water and the campaign lengthens. Choose another because it is faster and the march may become harsher than predicted. Kearny's preference for the mountain route and Santa Anna's costly encounter with destroyed wells show two sides of the same truth. Commanders in the Mexican-American War could not treat water as a background detail. It shaped route selection, operational tempo, and the condition of the army at the moment of contact. There is one more thing about water scarcity that deserves attention. It created a memory stronger than many other hardships. Men may forget the exact order in which camps were made, or how many miles they covered on a particular date, but they remember thirst. They remember the moment water came into view. They remember bad water that had to be drunk because nothing else existed. They remember watching animals crowd around a source. They remember being told to wait. They remember whether officers seemed to understand the seriousness of the situation. In that sense, water shaped not only survival, but also the emotional memory of a campaign. A battle might be written about because it seemed important to history. A spring might remain more vivid to the soldier because it felt important to life. The Mexican-American War was full of movements that appeared, in official summary, to be clean and orderly. Kearny marched to Santa Fe. Santa Anna marched north. The Mormon Battalion crossed the southwest. Reinforcements moved along the Santa Fe Trail. These statements are true, but they conceal the body-level reality that made those operations so difficult. Every one of those movements depended on access to water across country that offered it unevenly. The Army of the West chose a longer route partly because it promised better water. Santa Anna's troops marched through a landscape where wells had been ruined and where the final approach to battle crossed 50 waterless miles. Trail users understood that some roads were faster only if you knew exactly where the next drink would come from. These were not incidental details. They were the framework within which the march occurred, and scarcity did not end once a battle began. The Army history of Buena Vista notes that Santa Anna's decision to retreat after the fighting was shaped in part by lack of food and water. This is important because it shows that water did not merely determine whether troops could reach the battlefield. It could also influence how long they could remain there. Even a force with numerical superiority might find its options narrowing if its men and animals had no dependable means of replenishment. In war, people often ask which side had more troops, more guns or better positions. In dry country, there is another question sitting beside those: which side can still drink tomorrow? There is a modern habit of treating water as something almost too basic to think about. It arrives from a tap. It waits in a bottle. It is available in stores, fountains, refrigerators, cafes, car cup holders, gym bags, and bedside glasses. We notice its absence mainly when we forgot to bring some. The soldiers of these campaigns lived in a completely different relationship with it. Water had to be found, reached, carried, guarded, and stretched. If too much was consumed too soon, the future suffered. If too little was taken, the present became miserable and dangerous. There was no ideal answer, only choices made under pressure. That is why water was never enough. Even when there was some, armies wanted more, men wanted more, animals needed more. Routes were chosen because one path offered better access than another, not because it solved the problem entirely. A full canteen did not guarantee safety. It only postponed fear. A spring at camp did not erase the next day's dry march. It only made the next day possible. The desert campaigns of the Mexican-American War were deadly in part because they taught every soldier a lesson that civilian life often lets us forget. Survival is not maintained by courage alone. Sometimes it rests on whether someone judged the next war to stop correctly. And once men were thirsty, everything else on the road became harder to endure. The dust felt thicker, the sand seemed deeper. The distance between one step and the next became more irritating. A body deprived of water does not move through dry country with patience. It fights the ground. That ground, especially in the broad stretches of dust and loose soil that armies had to cross, had its own way of making every mile more expensive. Once water began to run low, the road itself seemed to grow more hostile, not because it changed in any dramatic way, not because the ground suddenly opened or the landscape announced that it had decided to become crueler, but because every part of it became harder to tolerate. Dust that might have been merely annoying in the morning felt suffocating by noon. Sand that seemed loose but passable at first became a thing men cursed under their breath with every step. The slow creak of wagons began to sound less like travel and more like delay. Even the space between one camp and the next seemed to expand. A march across dry country was not only a matter of heat and thirst, it was also the endless physical punishment of moving over ground that resisted being crossed. This part of the Mexican-American War is easy to underestimate because dust leaves no casualty list of its own. Historians can count battles. They can record deaths from disease. They can measure marches in miles. But dust is harder to isolate. It worked inside everything. It coated faces and hair. It collected in the folds of uniforms. It settled on food. It entered nostrils, throats, and eyes. It turned the simple act of breathing into something men noticed. National Park Service summaries of the Santa Fe Trail describe dust, mud, insects, and heat as the ordinary discomforts trail travellers experienced, and that word, ordinary, matters. Dust was not a rare disaster. It was a repeated condition of movement in the western corridors used during the war. When military columns entered those same routes, the discomfort did not disappear. It multiplied. Picture a long column on a dry trail. The front rank raises the first fine layer of dirt. The horses lift more. The mules and oxen deepen it. The wheels of the wagons grind through the surface and throw it back into the air. By the time the middle of the column passes, the men there are no longer walking through clear morning light. They are walking through what everyone ahead of them has disturbed. Those farther back receive the worst of it. They march inside the evidence of the army's own movement, breathing what the column has made. There is no simple way around it. Spread out too far and the unit loses order. Stay close and the dust thickens. A soldier who wipes his face only smears the grit into sweat. A man who licks dry lips tastes dirt. By afternoon, he may feel as though the road has entered him, and dust did not trouble only the infantry. Wagon travel created its own misery. The Santa Fe Trail was a road in the practical sense, but it was not a smooth surface prepared for mass military transport. The National Park Service's History of Santa Fe Wagons notes that the wagons required constant attention and that conditions of whirling sand and dust forced repeated maintenance. This is one of those details that sounds small until you consider what a military expedition depended on. A wagon was not merely a cart. It might carry flour, ammunition, tents, medical gear, tools, or the personal property of officers. It might eventually carry sick men who had failed on the march. If dust worked its way into wheel hubs, if sand slowed progress, if axles suffered, the army did not lose comfort alone. It lost time. Time was dangerous in desert campaigning. A delay in green country is often inconvenient. A delay in dry country can alter the entire day's survival plan. If a line of wagons slows in deep sand, men waiting behind them remain under the sun longer. Animals spend more strength for less distance. The next water source remains farther away than expected. Camp may be made late after the body is given more than it had budgeted. This is why sand mattered so much. It made distance deceptive. 10 miles over firm ground and 10 miles through soft sand are not the same military problem, even if the map pretends they are. The latter consumes far more from men, teams, and schedules. The Mormon Battalion's march to California during the war provides one of the clearest descriptions of this problem. Accounts of the journey describe roads so sandy that soldiers had to assist the teams physically. One historical summary from Brigham Young University notes that, in especially difficult stretches, a double file of foot soldiers walked ahead of the wagons, stomping down the sand in the ruts so the wheels would have firmer ground. The file was rotated every hour. That is a remarkable image. Men already marching under difficult conditions took turns preparing the road with their own bodies so wagons could continue. They were not merely following a path, they were compacting one as they went. Another account of the same march, preserving earlier testimony, describes men carrying blankets, knapsacks, cartridge boxes and muskets, while also pulling long ropes to help drag wagons through sand. It states plainly that deep sand alone, even without a load, was enough to wear out both man and beast. Later, 20 men were assigned to each wagon to help teams haul the vehicles over sandhills. That is not a small inconvenience. It is the conversion of infantry strength into draft power. Every soldier assigned to a rope is expending energy beyond the normal burden of marching. Every wagon that must be hauled this way slows the entire column. The desert was not only difficult to cross, it demanded labour simply to remain passable. There is a particular unfairness in deep sand. On hard ground, effort turns into progress with a kind of honesty. You step, you move, the body understands the bargain. Sand changes the bargain. The foot sinks, the ankle shifts, the leg works harder than the distance seems to justify. A wagon wheel buries itself and must be urged upward only to sink again a few yards later. Mules pull with their whole weight, while handlers shout and men brace themselves against ropes. Nothing appears fast, nothing feels efficient. The march becomes repetitive exertion stripped of momentum. It is not dramatic in the way a charge is dramatic, but it is the kind of labour that quietly ruins an army's strength. And all of this happened while men were already dealing with thirst, heat, short rations, and long distances. The Mormon Battalion example makes the point clearly because the struggle with sand came amid a larger ordeal, not in isolation. But similar principles applied wherever military traffic met loose ground. The Santa Fe Trail's surviving swales and ruts are reminders that thousands of wagons physically carved their movement into the landscape. National Park Service materials explain that wagon traffic, hooves and weather reshaped the trail itself over time. During war, when columns moved with urgency and often with heavier logistical needs, the earth under them was not a passive surface. It was being churned, cut and loosened by the very effort to cross it. This had a human effect that went beyond the muscles. Dust and sand narrowed attention. A soldier might begin the day thinking about the campaign, the enemy, the rumoured destination, or whether letters from home would ever catch up with him. Several hours later, his world shrank to immediate discomfort. Do not trip. keep the grit out of your eyes. Watch the mule ahead. Hope the wagon clears the rise. Wait for the column to move again. Try not to cough too much, because coughing only makes the throat hurt more. History often remembers men at their most purposeful, delivering orders, firing weapons, standing firm. Marching through dust forced them into a more basic state. It reduced ambition to endurance. The eyes suffered in ways that are easy to imagine once you pause over them. Bright light, wind, and airborne grit made seeing the road difficult. A man could squint against glare, but squinting for hours creates its own fatigue. Dust in the eyes made them burn and water. Wiping them with dirty fingers offered little relief. Officers scanning ahead for terrain or signs of movement faced the same problem. Scouts depended on seeing clearly. Teamsters needed to judge ground in front of the wagons. Soldiers needed to watch their footing. In loose or broken terrain, a moment of blurred vision could mean a stumble, a twisted ankle, or an unnecessary fall. The desert did not need to blind men fully to make them less capable. It only needed to make clear sight harder to maintain. Then there was the mouth, dust mixed with thirst in a particularly miserable way. A man short on water had no easy means to clear his throat. The taste of grit remained. Food, when it came, could be gritty too. Trail travellers generally knew dust as part of daily movement, and in an army column the effect would have been intensified by sheer volume of traffic. That means the discomfort entered meals and rest as well as the march itself. A soldier might arrive at camp, sit down beside his ration, and still feel as though he were chewing part of the road. It sounds almost trivial from a distance. It would not have felt trivial after weeks of movement. The animals carried their share of this burden. Hooves sank in sand, wheels dragged behind them, harness rubbed over dust-coated hides. Team animals needed more effort to produce less motion, especially when pulling wagons through soft ground or over sandy rises. The Mormon battalion's use of soldiers to help teams pull wagons makes clear that animals alone could not always handle the terrain. When the teams weakened, men stepped in. When men weakened, the march slowed. The entire system depended on a transfer of strain from one part of the column to another, and there was never an unlimited reserve of strength waiting nearby. One of the things I find most striking about these marches is how often difficulty came from problems that sound unimpressive when listed separately. Dust, sand, a wheel stuck in a rut, a wagon needing help over a rise, a throat that would not stop feeling dry. None of these appears on a monument. None of them becomes a famous scene in a painting. Yet together they explain why long marches could become deadly without a battle. The body does not care whether it is being destroyed by one spectacular hardship or by 50 smaller ones repeated all day. Exhaustion keeps its own account. There is also a difference between travelling through dust and being responsible for movement through dust. A civilian traveller may resent a difficult road. A military teamster has to solve it. Officers have to keep the train organised. Men assigned to assist wagons cannot simply admire their own suffering and stop. They continue because the supplies behind them matter to the survival of everyone else. If a wagon train fails, the hardship spreads beyond those nearest the stuck wheels. Rations, ammunition, and medical stores arrive late or not at all. In desert campaigns, the road and the supply system were joined so tightly that a stretch of soft ground could have consequences far beyond the patch of sand itself. That is why military marches through dry country had such a different character from marches through settled farmland. In settled areas, a road might be rutted, wet, or narrow, but the army could sometimes distribute itself across villages and fields. In the western corridors of the Mexican-American War, the routes were often thinner, more exposed, and less forgiving. The Santa Fe Trail linked major places across enormous spaces, but much of it remained trail rather than engineered road. National Park Service documentation of the trail emphasises crossings, swales, ruts, water-limited routes, and the hazards of moving wagons through the landscape. The army inherited all of that. It did not march over an empty map. It marched over the same practical obstacles that traders, migrants and freighters had long known, now magnified by military scale. Sometimes the road left visible scars long after the men passed. Ruts carved into the Santa Fe Trail landscape still survive, and educational materials from the National Park Service note that thousands of wagons crossed certain places, leaving impressions in the earth. These traces are more than picturesque remnants. They help us understand the repetitive pressure of movement. A single wagon over soft ground is one thing. Hundreds of wagons following roughly the same line create a corridor of compression, erosion, and churned soil. Men during the Mexican-American War did not experience those routes as preserved historic sites. They experienced them at full force, with wheels dragging, stock straining, and dust rising around them. And because these marches were military operations, they often happened under pressure to maintain pace. Kearny's Army of the West moved rapidly towards Santa Fe in 1846. The campaign's broad outline can make the march appear almost clean, but every overland expedition into that region faced the physical realities of trail travel, and the army's advance depended on wagons, mounted troops, and supply movement across hundreds of miles. The NPS record of the 1846 to 1847 Santa Fe Trail timeline shows the strategic scale of the movement, while trail documentation shows the ground-level hardship of travel through long, exposed routes. What looks brisk in summary becomes punishing when broken into actual days of dust, loose earth, and repetitive strain. Santa Anna's army faced its own version of this misery on the march toward Buena Vista. The official army account emphasizes waterless desert, inadequate wagons, and starvation rations, but those conditions would have made road hardship worse rather than less significant. A hungry, thirsty man does not cross difficult ground with the same steadiness as a well-fed one. An army with weak animals and strained logistics suffers more from every bad mile. Even when surviving documents do not pause to describe every mouthful of dust, the combination of terrain, shortage, and forced pace makes the human cost clear. The dry road was not an incidental backdrop to the campaign. It was part of the pressure under which the troops arrived. Let me ask you to think about the last time you carried something heavy for longer than you expected. Perhaps a suitcase through an airport, grocery bags up several flights of stairs, a box during a move that seemed reasonable when you picked it up, and unreasonable 30 seconds later. The weight itself did not change, but your relationship to it changed with every step. Now put that feeling into a march that lasts all day. Add a musket, ammunition, a pack, dust in the throat, heat on the back of the neck, and ground that gives way beneath the foot instead of supporting it cleanly. That was not an unusual interruption to desert campaigning. It was the road as many soldiers knew it. The misery of every mile came from that accumulation. Sand turned walking into labour. Dust turned breathing into irritation. Wagons turned road conditions into army-wide delays. Animals weakened. Men were used as additional pulling power. The ice stung. The mouth stayed dry. The columns stretched and compressed according to obstacles. A rise that looked minor from a distance could occupy a large part of the afternoon if wagons bogged down. And through it all, officers still had to think ahead to water, food, camp, enemy movement, and the next day's march. The road did not simply connect one place to another, it spent strength from the force that crossed it. By the time a desert column stopped for the evening, the men were not always able to name what had worn them down most. It may not have been the heat alone. It may not have been thirst alone. It may have been the constant grinding discomfort of the route itself, the way dust irritated every exposed surface, and sand stole energy from every stride. A man could reach camp with no wound, no fever, no dramatic collapse, and still feel emptied by the road. That exhaustion mattered because war did not grant long recovery simply because the ground had been cruel. The next morning the wagons still needed to move, the animals still needed to be harnessed. The column still had miles to make, and if rations had begun to fail, if hunger was added to thirst and fatigue, then the next stretch of desert became harder still. The deeper an army moved into desert country, the more obvious it became that the soldiers were only one part of the march. A campaign was not made of men alone. It was made of wagons, teams, spare animals, sacks of flour, barrels of hard bread, ammunition chests, tents, medical stores, tools, blankets, forage, and all the ordinary objects that kept a 19th century army alive long enough to fight. When people imagine war, they usually picture the line of infantry or the cavalry riding forward. They do not picture the slower line behind them. The heavy wooden wheels, the cracking harness, the teamsters shouting at stubborn animals, the boxes tied down with rope, the axle that had to hold until evening because there was no workshop waiting nearby. But in desert campaigning during the Mexican-American War, that slower line mattered just as much as the troops at the front. If the wagons faltered, the army faltered with them. A wagon train was both a promise and a burden. It promised food, tents, medicine, powder, spare clothing, and the possibility of surviving long marches through thinly settled regions. It also slowed the army, demanded roads or at least passable trails, required water and grass for the animals that pulled it, and became vulnerable every time the ground turned rough. The Santa Fe Trail had already taught traders this lesson long before the war. Even in good conditions, wagon trains typically moved only about 12 to 15 miles in a day, and scouts searched ahead for camps that could provide water for people, water for animals, grass for oxen and horses, and ground that could be defended if necessary. That was travel under favourable circumstances. Armies marched under pressure, carrying more weight, tied to timetables, and often moving in regions where the next adequate camp was not guaranteed. This is why places like Bent's Fort mattered so much. Bent's Fort, on the mountain route of the Santa Fe Trail, offered travellers supplies, rest, and a known point of support in a difficult overland corridor. During the Mexican-American War in 1846, it became a staging area for Stephen W. Kearny's Army of the West. That detail is more than local colour. It shows how armies needed fixed points of recovery before pushing deeper into harsher country. A fort could gather stores, relay information, and temporarily restore men and animals before the route became less forgiving again. Without such places, the army's supply line was not a line at all. It was a gamble repeated across hundreds of miles. Kearny's force was operating at the far end of an enormous logistical chain. One military analysis of his campaign notes that the Army of the West functioned at the end of an 800-mile supply line once it occupied Santa Fe. That meant supply wagons travelling between the Missouri frontier and New Mexico had to be protected, and Missouri volunteers were used to secure movement along parts of the trail so that those wagons could reach the army. This is the side of conquest that rarely receives much attention. Territory could be seized quickly, but holding it required movement of goods over immense distances. The army in Santa Fe did not become self-sustaining simply because it raised a flag. It still needed what came behind it. Flour still had to arrive, medicine still had to arrive, replacement equipment still had to arrive, and every mile of trail between those stores and the men waiting for them was a place where delay could begin. The men felt the consequences of those limitations almost immediately. During Kearny's first leg from Fort Leavenworth to Santa Fe, the journey stretched roughly 900 miles over 50 days through wilderness, desert, and mountains. By early July, many soldiers were already sick, lame, and exhausted. Some were too weak to continue under their own power, and the wagons began filling with incapacitated men. That shift tells us something important. Wagons intended to support the army's advance were now being used as ambulances. They were not simply carrying extra burden. They were carrying men who could no longer march, which meant less room for the supplies the army also needed. This is how desert logistics began breaking apart. Not with a dramatic collapse, but with substitutions. A wagon space meant for one thing was surrendered to another, because the road had already injured the column. Once wagons began carrying the sick, the burden moved elsewhere. Supplies might be redistributed, loads might be packed tighter, animals might be asked to pull more, Teamsters might have to handle heavier strain. Officers might decide that some baggage mattered less than continued movement. None of those choices were harmless. Every item abandoned or delayed represented something the army had once judged worth hauling. Spare clothing mattered when uniforms tore. Food mattered when local purchase failed. Medical stores mattered when disease spread. Tools mattered when repairs became urgent. A supply system has very little wasted capacity when it is moving through dry country. What looks like excess from the outside often proves to be the margin that keeps an expedition from becoming desperate later. And then there were the animals. Horses, mules, oxen and cattle formed the muscle of 19th century military movement. They pulled wagons, carried officers, moved artillery, transported baggage, and sometimes provided food when circumstances became bad enough. But animals did not consume less because the army was in a hurry. They required water, they required forage, they required time to recover. The Santa Fe Trail's scouting practices reflected this reality, since camps had to be chosen with grass for animals in mind as much as water for men. A column might include soldiers willing to complain but still obey orders. Draft animals did not argue, they simply weakened. Their pace slowed, their ribs sharpened, their steps shortened, and at a certain point a team that had moved faithfully for hundreds of miles could no longer do what the army required. Kearny's own campaign exposed this problem as the force moved west from Santa Fe toward California. According to the Army Historical Foundation's account, the eastern portion of his journey to Bent's Fort had provided enough food, water, and natural resources for men and animals, but the regions farther west and nearer the mountains lacked the supplies the army needed. The hardship intensified as the expedition moved into more difficult country. That change in the landscape forced a change in logistics. 200 miles west of Santa Fe, Kearny decided he could not continue effectively with the force as originally organised. He sent 200 dragoons, 2 cannons, and the accompanying wagon train back to Santa Fe to expedite our march to the Pacific. Horses already worn by the route were exchanged for mules, and pack mules were brought forward to replace the wagons for the detachment that continued west. That decision reveals the hard choice at the centre of desert logistics. Wagons could carry more, but they were slow, demanding and vulnerable to terrain. Pack mules carried less, but they could move where wagons struggled and let a smaller force travel with greater speed. Kearny was not merely adjusting transportation methods. He was admitting that the country ahead would not tolerate the same logistical structure that had brought him to Santa Fe. To keep moving, he had to reduce the physical footprint of his force. He gave up some weight-carrying capacity in exchange for mobility. That kind of decision could preserve an expedition, but it also left less room for comfort and less room for error. The lighter the column became, the more carefully every item had to justify itself. Captain Philip St. George Cook was then instructed to take command of the Mormon battalion and escort the wagons toward California, while Kearny's reduced force moved more quickly ahead. This created 2 different versions of the Western March. One force travelled lighter and faster, trying to cover ground with only the essentials. Another remained tied to slower transport, burdened with wagons that still had to be dragged over immense distances. The decision made sense militarily, but it also demonstrates how supply lines could divide an army's experience of the same campaign. Some men were punished by scarcity, others were punished by weight. Everyone was still moving through country that demanded more than the army had expected to give. The Mormon battalion's long march shows the misery of that wagon-bound movement in human terms. By the time approximately 330 members reached San Diego in January 1847, they had endured a journey of nearly 2,000 miles under army direction. Later recollections and historical summaries emphasize hunger, thirst, cold, ragged clothing, and exhaustion. They also note that the battalion helped establish a practical wagon road to the Pacific coast. That achievement sounds impressive from a distance, and it was. But a wagon road in that environment did not appear because men selected a convenient line on a map. It emerged because soldiers, animals and vehicles repeatedly forced passage through regions that resisted wheeled transport. Every usable mile represented labour. Wagons could break a march in many ways. Wheels split, axles strained, load shifted, teams bogged down. Harness failed. A vehicle that became stuck or damaged forced the column to slow, and the cost of delay multiplied in hot, dry country. Men waiting under the sun consumed strength without gaining distance. Animals standing in harness continued to tire. Water allotted for the day kept disappearing whether the wagons moved or not. A supply train could fall behind not because of one disaster, but because of many interruptions that were individually small and collectively severe. A march recorded later as a single line of advance may have been made of dozens of stops, shouts, repairs, unloading, relashing, and painful attempts to coax exhausted teams forward. The dependence on animals created another vulnerability. If forage was scarce, animals weakened. If animals weakened, loads had to be reduced or transferred. If loads were transferred, other animals were burdened further, or men had to help. If men helped, they spent energy meant for marching. The supply system could therefore turn inward on itself, taking strength from one part of the column to compensate for weakness in another. Nothing about this was abstract to the people experiencing it. A soldier ordered to help pull or steady a wagon understood immediately that every problem with transport became a problem for the infantry. A teamster whose animals could no longer manage a rise understood that failure might strand stores that everyone needed. The desert turned logistics into shared suffering. Even a functioning wagon train moved slowly enough to shape military decisions. 12 to 15 miles in a day under good Santa Fe trail conditions may sound respectable, until you remember that the campaign spaces were measured in the hundreds of miles. A commander planning around wagons had to accept that distance would be consumed gradually. He could not simply push indefinitely without considering what the teams could endure. If he demanded too much speed, he risked losing the very transport that made the expedition possible. If he moved too cautiously, he risked strategic delay, dwindling rations, and missed opportunities. The march was therefore always a compromise between military ambition and mechanical reality. The Mexican side of the war faced the same problem, and in some respects an even harsher version of it. Santa Anna's army moving north toward Buena Vista struggled with inadequate wagons and starvation rations. Official US Army history describes the army's difficult approach, including severe supply shortcomings before the battle. After Buena Vista, Santa Anna faced the possibility of another attack and the disintegration of his army because food and water were running short. That statement matters because it shows logistics not as a distant administrative concern, but as a force that could determine whether an army remained an army at all. Men may continue to obey orders through fatigue. They may continue through fear. They cannot continue indefinitely when supply collapses beneath them. Santa Anna's circumstances also reveal something easily forgotten when discussing desert marches. A commander might have courage, numerical strength, and aggressive intent, yet still be constrained by wagons. Without enough transport, rations could not move reliably. Without enough rations, men weakened. Without reliable supply, an army's ability to pursue victory narrowed. Histories of Buena Vista often focus on the battlefield decisions, but the condition of Santa Anna's army before and after the battle cannot be separated from the difficulty of bringing a large force through barren country with inadequate logistical support. The desert did not need to defeat that army outright. It only needed to make the next decision worse. What makes all of this especially severe is that supply lines in the Mexican-American War were not short, protected roads linking one developed depot to another. In the Western Theatre, they extended over remote stretches where the army had to rely on trail systems, staging points, escort detachments, and local procurement. The Army of the West could occupy Santa Fe, but it still depended on the Santa Fe Trail behind it. Kearny could continue toward California, but only after lightening his force and altering its transport. Santa Anna could march north, but not without suffering from the lack of wagons, water and provisions. In every case, movement required more than will. It required an entire structure of transport that was constantly threatened by distance. There's a useful way to think about it. A wagon was stored time. It carried food that allowed tomorrow's march. It carried ammunition that allowed tomorrow's fight. It carried medicine that might keep a fever from becoming a death sentence. It carried tents and blankets that made nights slightly less punishing. When wagons fell behind, tomorrow became less secure. When animals collapsed, time was lost with them. When supply routes stretched across 800 miles of difficult country, every mile increased the chance that the future would arrive late. That was the danger. An army could look intact while its tomorrow was already being damaged. And this strain changed the meaning of abundance. A stack of flour sacks in a depot looked reassuring. A barrel of provisions loaded onto a wagon looked like preparation. But a ration was not useful merely because it existed somewhere in the system. It had to arrive. It had to survive the journey. It had to reach the men before hunger weakened them. If a wagon axle failed, if animals gave out, if a trail delay added days, the food might remain technically part of the army's supply, while being practically unavailable to those who needed it. Desert campaigns exposed the difference between possessing resources and delivering them. This is one of the reasons the marches were so deadly. They forced armies to live in the gap between what had been planned and what actually arrived. The plan said supplies would continue forward. The road said otherwise. The plan said animals would pull the train. The desert asked whether they had enough grass and water. The plan said wounded and sick could be carried when necessary. The reality was that carrying them consumed the very transport needed for everything else. None of this required incompetence in every case. It was simply the problem of moving large 19th century forces across regions that resisted large 19th century forces. By late in a march, the breaking of a supply system could be felt without anyone announcing that it had happened. Meals became smaller or more monotonous. Men grew more interested in rumours of arriving wagons. Officers watched the state of animals with unusual intensity. Teamsters cursed more often. Sick soldiers looked at every passing vehicle differently, because they understood that a place on a wagon might decide whether they continued at all. A camp did not need to be in panic to be under strain. It only needed to begin operating with less margin than before. That was how the desert wore down armies. It reduced margin everywhere, and once margin disappeared, hunger moved closer. The wagons carried food, but only if they arrived. The animals carried the wagons, but only if they remained strong. The routes offered supply points, but only where geography allowed. When any one of those conditions failed, the men at the end of the chain began eating less, waiting longer, and marching on bodies that were receiving too little in return. The next danger was already present inside the logistics. It was the ration sack that did not come forward in time, the meal cut shorter than promised, the soldier who began another day of movement with less strength than the road demanded. The next danger was already present inside the logistics. It was the ration sack that did not come forward in time, the meal cut shorter than promised, the soldier who began another day of movement with less strength than the road demanded. Hunger rarely arrived in a single dramatic moment. It crept in more quietly than thirst. A man might wake convinced he was merely tired. He might blame the ache in his legs on the previous day's march, the heaviness in his shoulders on the musket, the slight dizziness on the heat. But when the body's repeatedly asked to work hard while receiving too little in return, it begins to change. The stride shortens. Temper grows thinner. Small frustrations become larger. The mind wanders toward food in the same way a thirsty mind wanders toward water. And during the desert marches of the Mexican-American War, there were moments when the rations began failing before the soldiers themselves did, leaving men to continue forward on strength they were already spending faster than they could replace it. On paper, the US Army ration during the Mexican War looked substantial enough to sustain a man under ordinary conditions. The ration established by Congress in 1838 included beef or pork, flour or bread, dried beans, sugar, salt, coffee, vinegar, candles, and soap. The National Park Service summarises it as 20 ounces of beef, 18 ounces of flour, a little over 2 ounces of dried beans, nearly 2 ounces of sugar, and smaller allowances of salt, green coffee, vinegar, and other items. There was protein, fat, starch, salt, and caffeine. It was not luxurious, but it was designed to feed soldiers engaged in military service. The problem was that the ration existed within a chain of assumptions. It assumed the food had been procured. It assumed it had been loaded. It assumed the wagons stayed upright. The animals remained strong. The roads remained passable. And the supplies arrived where the men were waiting. Desert campaigning attacked every one of those assumptions. There is also a difference between a ration being adequate in theory and satisfying in practice. Much of what soldiers received required preparation. Green coffee had to be roasted, ground, and brewed. Flour had to be turned into something edible. Meat might be salted, tough, or difficult to cook well in camp conditions. Beans required time and fuel. Vinegar and salt added some variety, but variety was still narrow. The food could keep a man alive when issued consistently and prepared properly. It was much less comforting when the army was tired, fuel was scarce, kettles were not easily managed, or the meal had to be rushed before another march. A ration that looked serviceable in a quartermaster table could feel mean and insufficient after a day of marching through dry country under a punishing sun. The American columns moving west learned this repeatedly. Kearny's Army of the West advanced towards Santa Fe through immense distances, and the farther such forces travelled from reliable supply points, the more fragile the feeding system became. Even when no outright famine occurred, short rations could appear along the march. A later historical account of Kearny's advance noted that the men endured the toils of the road despite short rations, and that detail fits the broader picture created by official army medical records describing exhaustion, sickness, and wagons increasingly used to carry men no longer able to continue on foot. Food shortage was not the only cause of that deterioration, but it belonged to the same pattern of strain. Men marched hard, slept poorly, drank uncertainly, and did not always eat enough to recover fully from one day before the next began. The farther west the campaigns reached, the more severe this relationship between movement and hunger became. The Mormon Battalion's experience offers one of the clearest windows into what prolonged scarcity felt like. These volunteers were promised the same pay, rations, and allowances as other infantry volunteers when they entered federal service. That promise mattered. It meant the men began their march expecting the army to feed them according to an established system. Yet once they moved across the southwest toward California, the conditions of the route repeatedly stripped away the comfort those promises implied. The march lengthened, the terrain worsened, the animals weakened, and the men increasingly lived on reduced provisions while still being asked to help drag wagons through sand, widen passages through rock, and sustain one of the longest infantry marches in American military history. The desert leg from the Colorado River toward the Pacific was especially brutal. A historical account based on battalion sources described stretches of deep sand, severe temperature swings, little water, and too little food. Colonel Philip St. George Cook reported that after days of exhausting travel, he found men arriving at camp completely worn down. On one morning near Carrizo Creek, he noted that they were eating the last 4 ounces of flour and that sugar and coffee had been gone for weeks. That single detail says a great deal. Flour was not a side item. It was one of the main anchors of the daily ration. 4 ounces was not a meal designed to restore a marching soldier. It was the remnant of a system barely holding together. Think about what that meant inside the body. A man may be able to survive on a reduced ration for a time, but survival and sustained military labour are not the same thing. These men were not lying still in camp waiting for food. They were moving. They were helping teams through sand. They were crossing terrain where water itself had become uncertain. They were suffering from worn-out shoes, some wrapping rawhide around their feet or improvising coverings from whatever they could manage. Hunger did not appear separately from those hardships. It joined them. The body that might endure sand with enough food now had less reserve. The mind that might remain cheerful under fatigue began to grow duller. When men reached water after nearly collapsing along the road, the shortage of food was part of why they had so little left. There is a kind of hunger that makes a person complain. There is another kind that quiets him. The battalion accounts suggest the second. Men became too weak to speak before reaching water, or having it brought to them. Others lay exhausted by the roadside. These descriptions came in a section of the march where thirst, fatigue, cold nights, hot days, and food shortage were all operating together. It is impossible to separate each hardship neatly, and that is precisely the point. Desert marches were deadly because scarcity came in combinations. Too little water made food harder to manage. Too little food made heat harder to endure. Too little rest made both of them worse. When soldiers failed, they often failed under the total weight of all three. The same truth appears on the Mexican side of the war with even greater force. Santa Anna's march toward Buena Vista offers a stark example of an army moving fast, while its supply base failed to keep pace. Official US Army history describes a force of roughly 21,500 men moving north from San Luis Potosí across dry and barren land. The Mexican army lacked sufficient wagons to carry enough rations for such a large body of troops, and the region through which it marched could not fully support the movement. The result was bluntly stated. By the time Santa Anna's men neared their destination, they were half-starved. Their forced progress was impressive. They covered about 240 miles in roughly 21 days through desert country, while subsisting on starvation rations. But the achievement came at a terrible cost. This is one of the most revealing episodes in the war because it shows that hunger was not simply the result of poor individual discipline or lazy preparation. It was built into the movement of a large army through a region unable to sustain it. Santa Anna needed to move quickly to strike Taylor's position before the Americans consolidated further. He did not have the logistical means to do that comfortably. His army marched anyway. That decision may have been understandable from a military point of view, but it meant the men themselves absorbed the difference between what strategy demanded and what the supply system could provide. They ate less so the army could keep moving. They became weaker so the timetable could be preserved. The hunger inside Santa Anna's army became so severe that discipline itself hardened in response. The army account says Santa Anna ordered that any man found more than 1.5 miles from camp be shot as a deserter, even if he had fallen behind while foraging for food or because he was too weak to maintain the pace. That detail is difficult to read calmly. It reveals an army under such strain that ordinary signs of survival behaviour had become intolerable to the command structure. Men wandering from camp in search of food threatened discipline and possibly the cohesion of the force. Santa Anna answered that threat with terror. Hunger had reached a point where it was reshaping the relationship between soldiers and commander, and still the men marched. That too deserves to be said. It would be easy to reduce those Mexican soldiers to anonymous sufferers under incompetent leadership, but that would miss the endurance they demonstrated. They advanced through winter hardship, inadequate clothing, limited transport, hunger and thirst, and still reached the vicinity of Buena Vista in condition to fight a major battle. The official army study later emphasized that they had done everything asked of them, marching nearly 500 miles in 40 days, fighting hard, and then suffering catastrophic losses from battle, hunger, disease, and desertion. Their failure was not a failure of toughness. It was the predictable outcome of asking bodies to perform beyond what supplies could sustain. The Americans understood the value of food partly because they feared what would happen when it vanished. Near Buena Vista, the US forces deliberately burned remaining stores at Agua Nueva as they withdrew to La Angostura, preventing Santa Anna from capturing them. That action made sense militarily. Supplies denied to the enemy can matter as much as supplies retained for oneself. Yet it also illustrates how closely food was tied to operational survival. Those stores were worth burning because they were worth fighting over. In a region where a large Mexican army was already hungry, every barrel and sack represented time, movement, and strength. Later, after the Battle of Buena Vista, Santa Anna chose not to risk another attack, in part because of lack of food and water and the possible disintegration of his army. This brings hunger directly into the realm of strategic decision. It was not merely a background suffering borne by the rank and file. It influenced whether an army continued offensive action at all. Santa Anna had fought Taylor's much smaller force and come close enough to success that the battle remained one of the great might-have-beens of the War for Mexico. But hunger and thirst were among the forces limiting what he could still ask of his men afterward. By that point, scarcity had become military judgment. There is a subtle cruelty in the way hunger affects morale. Thirst can produce urgency. Heat can produce visible distress. Hunger often produces a heavier kind of discouragement. The men still stand. They still answer roll. They still shoulder arms. But they know that the next march will begin before their bodies have been fully restored. They eat slowly because there is not much. Or they eat quickly because the portion is too small to linger over. They talk about food because it is safe to talk about. They imagine meals from home, bread, stew, corn cakes, fresh meat, coffee with enough sugar to taste like something pleasant rather than medicine. Soldiers have done this in every war. It is not sentimental weakness. It is what the mind does when one of the body's oldest needs is being denied. The Mexican war sources do not need to record every private conversation for us to understand the habit. We can infer it from the plain evidence of shortage, shrinking rations, and the repeated emphasis placed on food in campaign accounts. The standard ration itself becomes more interesting once viewed from a hungry march. Coffee, for example, was not merely a pleasant drink. It was one of the few daily comforts in a soldier's life, and during the Mormon Battalion's hardest desert stage, Cook noted that coffee had been gone for weeks. That absence matters, because the ration was not only calories, it helped create routine. Morning coffee gave shape to a day. Sugar changed the taste of hardship. Vinegar and salt made monotonous food easier to endure. When those smaller items disappeared, the ration became not only less nutritious or less satisfying, but less human. The distance between fed and kept alive grew wider. There was also the problem of local foraging and purchase. In settled regions, armies might supplement rations by buying or seizing grain, livestock or other food. In desert and semi-desert regions, the possibilities were more limited, especially when large armies moved through. A small ranch or village could not rescue thousands of hungry men. Santa Anna's troops suffered because the land was too barren to support their movement at the scale required. Kearny's forces and the battalion encountered similar limits as distance increased and military movement outpaced easy resupply. Food in such landscapes had to be carried, and carried food could fail through distance. The farther the army moved from depots, the closer it came to eating the margin from its own future. That margin was never large. A soldier's ration in regulation form might suggest order and predictability, but the march was full of irregularity. Some days were longer than expected, some wagons arrived late, some animals weakened, some roads were worse than scouts believed, some men became sick and needed care. Every surprise consumed more of the army's limited reserve. Hunger on the march often reflected not one failed decision, but a series of small pressures that pushed the whole system toward shortage. That is why rations could begin to fail even when no commander had deliberately decided to starve his men. The system was simply less resilient than the environment was harsh, and once ration failure began, it affected not only the number of calories consumed, but the willingness to perform extra labour. Consider again the Mormon battalion helping wagons through sand while living on short rations. That is exactly the sort of labour that hunger makes more punishing. The men had to carry their own gear, march, and then pull at ropes to assist the teams. A well-fed body complains under that load. An underfed body spends itself much more quickly. By the time Cook described his men as worn down near Carrizo Creek, the condition was not mysterious. The road had demanded physical output for which the ration system had stopped paying in full. The same relationship likely worsened illness. The Army medical history of the war makes clear that disease was already a major burden in the campaigns. Men weakened by exposure, fatigue, inadequate water, and reduced food would have had less ability to recover from sickness. We should be careful not to assign every illness to hunger, because the sources do not support that kind of precision. But as a reasonable historical inference, undernourishment during exhausting marches likely made existing medical problems harder to withstand, particularly when paired with poor water and severe weather. The war's deadliest forces often overlapped rather than acting alone. There is also a difference between soldiers who know they will eat properly tonight and soldiers who suspect they will not. The first can divide their misery into manageable parts: march until camp, rest, eat, begin again. The second loses that rhythm. Camp becomes uncertain rather than reassuring. The evening fire no longer guarantees a meal worth waiting for. The body is tired, but the reward is small. That kind of repeated disappointment undermines morale in a way that official reports rarely capture cleanly. It helps explain why hunger shows up in the record alongside desertion, why men drifted from the line in search of food, why commanders feared the unravelling of discipline when provisions disappeared. At the same time, hunger could produce remarkable bursts of recovery when food or rest finally appeared. Cook observed that men who'd been prostrate and hopeless in the morning later recovered enough of their spirits to sing and play the fiddle in camp. That is one of the most human moments preserved from these marches. It reminds us that soldiers were not marching machines whose morale declined in a straight line. A little water, a little rest. Perhaps the knowledge that the worst stretch of the day had ended could briefly restore humour and community even after brutal suffering. The fact that such recovery seemed noteworthy tells us how low they had been driven beforehand. What makes hunger so important to understanding desert marches is that it reveals the limits of patriotic language. Governments recruit soldiers with promises of pay, honour, loyalty, necessity, and national purpose. Commanders speak in terms of objectives and victories. But a man who's marched 3 hard days with too little food lives at a more basic level. He still may believe in the cause, he still may obey. Yet his relationship to the war passes through his stomach as surely as through his ideas. This is not a criticism of him. It is a recognition of how armies actually function. Strategy depends on calories. Courage depends on bodies. A march continues only while the men can continue it. During the Mexican-American War, rations failed in different ways for different forces. American soldiers could be strained by distance, delayed supply, and the practical difficulty of carrying enough food into remote campaigns. The Mormon Battalion suffered deeply during its western march, with short rations becoming part of a broader struggle against terrain and thirst. Santa Anna's army suffered hunger on a larger and more catastrophic scale, reaching the battlefield after weeks of deprivation and then facing the prospect of disintegration when food and water could no longer sustain further offensive action. These were not separate stories. They were expressions of the same underlying fact. Desert war magnified the consequences of every weakness in supply. By the time a starving or half-starved soldier reached the end of another day, he did not simply want dinner. He wanted proof that the army had not forgotten him. Food meant the system still worked. It meant tomorrow had been considered. It meant the wagon train had not failed entirely, the quartermaster had not vanished into abstraction, and the long road ahead might still be crossed. When that proof became uncertain, everything else felt less secure. The march became psychologically as well as physically harsher. A man could still stand in formation, but part of him had begun calculating weakness rather than strength. and hunger opened the door to the next danger. A weakened body was more vulnerable to sickness. A fatigued soldier with too little food and poor water could be overcome by illness before he ever saw battle. Camps became places where exhaustion deepened instead of lifting. Men who began a march undernourished, overheated and dehydrated entered disease with far less reserve than they should have had. That was how the desert road pushed many soldiers toward collapse without ever firing a shot. And once a man had been weakened by heat, poor food, bad water, and day after day of hard movement, sickness did not need much help to take hold. This is the part of the Mexican-American War that tends to fade behind the battles, because sickness rarely gives history a dramatic scene to paint. There is no famous charge called the fever at Santa Fe. No engraved print titled Diarrhea on the Chihuahua Road. No patriotic ballad about a soldier who fell behind because his legs would no longer support him after weeks of marching and camp illness. Yet these were some of the most common ways men suffered. In the war as a whole, disease proved a more dangerous enemy than gunfire, and army medical historians later noted that volunteers often fell sick at far higher rates than regular soldiers. Malaria, measles, mumps, scurvy, dysentery and diarrhea all work through the ranks, but intestinal disease caused the most persistent trouble. To understand why this mattered so much during desert marches, you have to picture the condition in which sickness arrived. These men were not falling ill while resting in clean barracks with steady meals and easy access to doctors. Many were sleeping outdoors or in crowded temporary camps. They were drinking whatever water could be found. They were eating rations that could become monotonous or irregular. They were exposed to heat by day, cold by night, dust on the road, and exhaustion that accumulated faster than rest could remove it. A healthy body can endure a great deal. A body already worn down by campaign life becomes much easier for disease to claim. That is why the men who fell without a battle belong at the centre of this story. Their collapse was often the result of several hardships meeting in the same body at once. There is a quiet cruelty in the way illness begins on a march. At first, it may not look serious enough to stop for. A soldier wakes with stomach trouble and says nothing because half the company seems to be unwell. Another has chills in the morning but keeps his place in line because no one wants to be thought weak. Someone else has been coughing for days, yet he tightens his straps and moves out with the rest, because the column is moving, and he is still expected to move with it. Military discipline does not erase pain. It often teaches men to conceal it until concealment becomes impossible. By the time an officer notices that a soldier is swaying, lagging, or asking to ride, the illness may have been building for days. The road exposes what pride tries to hide. Stephen W. Kearny's Army of the West showed this early in the war. As it pushed towards Santa Fe in 1846, the march itself produced large numbers of sick, lame and exhausted soldiers. Some became too worn down to continue on foot, forcing wagons to carry men who had been expected to march. This is an important detail, because it reveals that sickness and exhaustion were already reshaping the army before it reached its political objective. The wagons did not become ambulances after a battle. They became ambulances because the march had damaged the column. A force could still look impressive on paper, but its real strength was being reduced mile by mile. And when Kearny divided his forces at Santa Fe, the men who remained in New Mexico and those who continued moving through the broader Western theatre did not suddenly escape the problem. Colonel Alexander Doniphan's Missouri Volunteers, who later marched south toward El Paso and Chihuahua, were already dealing with fevers and measles before setting out. They moved at an astonishing pace, at times covering as many as 50 miles in a day through hostile and difficult country, while facing short rations, inadequate water, and environmental dangers. Army medical history records that Doniphan's command eventually suffered a sick rate approaching 1/3 of its strength, with measles, fevers, and diarrhea common among the patients. That means the physical condition of the army had become a central operational issue, not a side note. Think about what 1/3 sickness means inside a marching force. It does not mean every third man is lying motionless in a tent. Some are still walking while unwell. Some are resting briefly and hoping to return to duty. Some are weak enough to need care, some are worse. It means the healthy men carry more burdens. Doctors have more patients than they can comfortably treat. Officers lose confidence in how many soldiers will be fit the next day, and everyone understands that the army is becoming less reliable, even if no enemy has attacked it. A regiment may keep its colours flying and its rollbooks intact, but the lived reality is different when 1/3 of the command is sick. The medical system itself struggled under this pressure. The army had surgeons, but not enough of them for the scale of illness that developed across theatres of the war. Army medical records show that in some units, only one medical officer marched with a volunteer regiment, even though Congress had allowed for more. Doniphan's command did not even have regular Army Medical Department surgeons with it. Its physicians were civilians or volunteers called upon to handle conditions far beyond ordinary practice. They treated fever, diarrhea, measles, wounds after battle, and the exhaustion created by travel through difficult country. That is another reason soldiers could fall without battle and stay fallen. The problem was not only getting sick. It was getting sick where medical help was thin, supplies were limited, and the column had no easy way to stop for long. Santa Fe became one of the clearest examples of what happened when the sick accumulated faster than a military post could absorb them. After Kearney and Doniphan moved on, many soldiers remaining in the area were afflicted by malaria contracted earlier, tonsillitis, colds, measles, dysentery, typhus, and other illnesses. The hospitals filled as more volunteers arrived. Supplies ran short. The physician Samuel de Camp fell ill himself while overseeing the hospital system. On November the 10th, 1846, 6 men died. 5 more died the next day, several from measles. A contemporary observer described troops dying from exposure and disease as the weather worsened and shelter proved inadequate. This is one of the most sobering facts in the entire Western campaign. Some men reached Santa Fe, survived the march that brought them there, and then died in the supposed safety of occupation. That tells us something important about exhaustion. It does not vanish the moment the march pauses. In some cases, stopping reveals just how much damage the march has done. A soldier who kept going by habit and momentum may collapse once the order to halt finally comes. A man with fever who forced himself through several hard days may worsen after reaching camp because the body has spent its reserve. A soldier who endured cold nights on the trail may develop respiratory illness later. By the time a command entered a town, established quarters, or converted buildings into hospitals, it was often dealing with problems already incubating along the road. Rest did not always mean recovery. Sometimes it was simply the point at which weakness became impossible to ignore. The Mormon Battalion's experience makes this visible in another way. During its long march toward California, illness became serious enough that 3 separate sick detachments were formed and diverted away from the main body toward Pueblo, Colorado. Church history records state that many men became ill, and that these detachments included soldiers unable to continue, along with nearly all of the women and children travelling with the battalion. The main body marched on under Philip St. George Cook, while those judged too sick or too vulnerable were separated from the expedition. This is a practical military decision, but it is also a human one. To be detached from the main body was to admit that the road ahead had become too much. It meant comrades kept moving west while the sick turned aside because continuing might kill them. Imagine being among those men. You enlisted expecting to complete the march. You may still believe you can. Then an officer tells you that you're not going forward with the others. Perhaps you're feverish. Perhaps you've been weakening for days. Perhaps your family is travelling with you, and the adults around you understand that the next stretch of road is not something a sick man or a child can safely endure. The column divides. Friends continue toward California. You go north toward Pueblo, not because the war has ended for you, but because your body has begun refusing its terms. Military histories often describe detachments in a few clean words. The lived experience must have felt much more personal than that. Illness on campaign was made worse by the medical understanding of the time. Army medical historians note that 19th century medicine still struggled to explain the causes of many diseases. Diarrhea and dysentery had long been known as camp afflictions, but physicians did not yet possess the later scientific understanding of infectious causes and sanitation. Doctors observed patterns. They recognised that disease spread in camps and that soldiers suffered from poor conditions. But preventive medicine remained limited by the knowledge and practices of the era. This mattered enormously during desert operations. Contaminated water, crowded camps, insufficient cleanliness, and weakened bodies formed an environment in which intestinal disease could thrive. The men were not simply unlucky, they were living inside conditions that made sickness likely. Dysentery and diarrhea deserve special attention because they were especially destructive during long marches. These illnesses drain a person rapidly. They weaken muscles, disrupt sleep, and make it difficult to retain strength, even when some food is available. On a campaign route, where water may already be limited and often of poor quality, the consequences become even more serious. A soldier suffering from intestinal disease needs rest, clean fluid, and time to recover. The march gives him very little of any of those. Instead, he is expected to keep moving or be placed in a wagon if space exists. That wagon then carries another sick man instead of other supplies. The body's private misery becomes part of the army's public burden. The volunteer soldiers were especially vulnerable. Army medical records state that volunteers fell ill at about twice the rate of regulars. Part of the explanation offered by the historians is that many were young farm boys who had not been exposed to certain communal diseases and who also lack familiarity with disciplined camp sanitation. That does not mean regular soldiers were safe. They were not. But it does mean the rapid expansion of the wartime army brought in large numbers of men whose bodies and habits were poorly matched to the disease environment of the campaign. The war asked them to become soldiers quickly. Their immune systems and camp routines did not always keep pace. Measles, in particular, could rip through units in ways modern readers may underestimate. In Taylor's army, Wool's men experienced a severe measles epidemic at Paris before the Buena Vista campaign. The medical history reports that the mortality became high, with some soldiers deteriorating rapidly after reaching severe stages of the disease. In Santa Fe, measles contributed to deaths among volunteers already weakened by exposure and poor shelter. Among Doniphan's men, measles formed part of the larger sick list. These were not childhood inconveniences in a pre-vaccine army. They were serious, sometimes fatal infections moving through men whose bodies had already been strained by travel and camp life. Scurvy appeared too, which is another revealing detail. At Santa Fe, Army medical officers observed that the diet available to troops lacked fresh produce, and by 1848 a substantial number of volunteers in one small command had suffered from scurvy during the previous quarter. Scurvy does not belong in our imagination of rapid active war. It sounds like something from long sea voyages, yet it appeared in a land campaign because a prolonged deficiency in diet can develop wherever armies live on restricted provisions without enough fresh food. This reminds us again that military suffering does not always announce itself with cannon. Sometimes it arrives through the slow failure of a ration system to nourish the body over time. There was also the problem of exposure. Desert campaigns are often remembered for heat, but many western marches also brought cold nights, wind, and inadequate shelter. At Santa Fe, mortality rose as the weather worsened, and not all volunteers could find sufficient protection from the elements. Men already sick from measles, dysentery, or fever faced greater danger when the temperature dropped. A soldier lying ill in a proper hospital with blankets and stable care has one set of odds. A soldier with fever in crowded quarters or poor shelter during a cold stretch in New Mexico has another. The war's deadliest conditions often came from the combination, not from any single hardship acting alone. One of the most telling comments in the Army medical history comes from DeCamp's view of the Missouri volunteers at Santa Fe. He complained that many had arrived in such poor health that they had not performed a single day's duty since leaving Missouri. His judgment was harsh, but it reveals how dramatically pre-existing weakness, recruitment standards, long-distance travel, and climate could interact. Some men joined the army already unhealthy, perhaps hoping the change of climate would help them, only to be carried west into conditions that made their health worse instead of better. The military machine counted them as manpower. The campaign revealed that they were not truly fit for what lay ahead. The men who fell without battle also changed the emotional world of those who remained on their feet. Imagine marching past a comrade who is no longer able to rise. Imagine hearing that another man from your company died in hospital, not from a wound anyone could honour publicly, but from fever or bowel disease. Imagine watching sick detachments peel away from the main body and wondering whether you will be next. Armies depend heavily on morale, and sickness drains morale in a different way than combat. Battle is terrifying, but it often arrives at a specific time and place. Illness lingers, it sits in camp, it appears at morning roll call as another absence. It returns every evening in the cough from the next tent, or the rumour that someone has worsened overnight. Doctors bore their own burden. The medical department was repeatedly overstretched, and some physicians themselves fell sick. In the broader theatre, surgeons confronted not only combat wounds, but overflowing hospitals, shortages of medicines, and the steady stream of disease patients. The Army medical history describes surgeons after Monterey as exhausted by their work, and that sense of medical fatigue fits the Western campaigns as well. When disease became widespread, medical care was not a reassuring background institution. It was another system under strain, trying to keep up while the war kept generating more need. It is tempting to divide deaths neatly into categories: battle deaths, disease deaths. Deaths from exposure, deaths from exhaustion. But the desert marches complicate those labels. A man might develop diarrhea because of unsafe water, worsen because he kept marching in heat, lose strength because rations were inadequate, and finally die in a hospital because his body could not recover. Which cause belongs on the line? The Army's paperwork might choose one. Reality offered several. That is why the men who fell without battle deserve to be understood not as background statistics, but as evidence of how the entire campaign worked. The march weakened them. The camp infected them. The supply system failed to restore them. The medical system could not always save them. And when we step back from the individual cases, the scale becomes hard to ignore. A modern study of dysentery in the US Army during the Mexican War found that infectious disease accounted for the overwhelming majority of American wartime deaths, with dysentery and related intestinal illnesses dominating the toll. Even without relying on the exact count in every detail, the general truth aligns with the Army Medical Department's own conclusion that disease was consistently more dangerous than the enemy. That fact should change how we imagine the war. The battles were important, but they were not the only places where the army lost men. A soldier could enlist, cross half a continent, never fire his weapon in anger, and still die because camp disease and campaign exhaustion met him first. There is something especially sobering about that, because the soldier who dies without battle often receives less memory. His end seems less dramatic to later generations. No charge to describe, no last stand, no flag planted. Yet for the men beside him, his death may have felt no less terrible. They watched him weaken. They may have helped carry him. They may have shared water with him, or saved a space for him in a wagon, or woken to learn he did not survive the night. War is not made honourable by the manner of death. It is simply made more honest when we remember all the ways it kills. By the time an army resumed its march after such losses, it moved with absences inside it. A missing file in the line, a wagon carrying another sick man, a campfire conversation quieter than before. officers recalculating numbers, surgeons writing new lists. The desert road had not only reduced physical strength, it had taken confidence. Men had learned that surviving the enemy did not guarantee surviving the campaign, and once sickness had worked through a marching force, the next decision made by commanders mattered even more. A bad map, an overconfident estimate, or one more forced movement through the wrong stretch of country could press men who were already near their limit past the point of return. The men who survived thirst, hunger, sickness, and the endless drag of wagons still had one more danger waiting above them, and it came from the people giving the orders. Not always because those commanders were careless, not always because they were foolish. Often they were operating with the information they had under real military pressure, trying to solve problems quickly while territory, weather, politics, and enemy movements all pressed at once. But in desert country, a decision that looked reasonable from a saddle or a headquarters table could become cruel once thousands of boots began following it. A route that appeared shorter might be harsher. A march that looked possible on paper might be ruinous in the body. A stream marked on a map might be too far, too low, too uncertain, or not nearly enough for the force expected to depend on it. The arithmetic of distance was never just arithmetic. It was time in the sun, water consumed, animals weakened, rations diminished, sick men left behind, and morale drawn tighter with every mile. This is where the Mexican-American War becomes especially revealing, because it unfolded across spaces the US Army was still learning how to understand at military scale. The Army's topographical engineers played a major role in the war by making reconnaissances, planning routes of advance, and charting little-known terrain. Their work mattered precisely because commanders could not rely on perfect geographic knowledge in the southwest or northern Mexico. The war was not fought only in places already known through dense networks of military roads and survey maps. It moved across regions where a route might be familiar to traders, local communities, guides, or earlier travellers, yet still be poorly translated into the kind of information an army needed before committing thousands of men to it. There is a difference between knowing that a road exists and knowing what it will cost an army to use it. A trail might be entirely real. It might appear on a map. It might have been travelled many times, but that does not answer the questions commanders most urgently needed answered. How many wagons can pass before the route becomes slow? How far is the next reliable water? Is there forage for hundreds of animals or only enough for a small caravan? Will a dry season make the ordinary stopping places useless? Can artillery follow? Can the sick be carried? Can the column camp in order at the end of the day? These questions rarely fit neatly into a broad map, yet in a desert campaign they decided whether a march remained difficult or became destructive. Stephen W. Kearny's Western Campaign shows this tension clearly. The strategic order sounded simple enough. Move toward New Mexico, secure Santa Fe, then continue toward California. In practice, the assignment required a force to travel more than 1,000 miles through grasslands, deserts and mountains, with the expectation that the movement should be completed before winter made mountain travel even worse. A military analysis of the campaign notes that this was one of the most audacious American operations of the war. That word is apt, because the march was not merely long. It demanded that command judgment remain sound across a changing landscape, with every stage of the route asking different things from men, animals and supplies. Kearny's first major routing choice already showed an awareness of that. His Army of the West followed the mountain route of the Santa Fe Trail rather than the shorter Cimarron route, in part because the mountain route offered more dependable water and access to Bent's Fort. This was a case where command decision respected the land instead of merely chasing the shortest line. The faster option on a map was not necessarily the safer one for a large army. Kearny's decision acknowledged that distances through arid country must be measured by resources, not by mileage alone. A longer march with better water could be less dangerous than a shorter march through a route where the next drink was less certain. But making one prudent decision did not remove the larger problem. Once Kearny entered New Mexico and turned toward California, the demands of the mission shifted. The country ahead was harsher, and the force originally suitable for the march to Santa Fe was not ideal for the push west. A military history of Kearny's California march notes that farther west, the region lacked the supplies needed to sustain the army in its previous form. About 200 miles beyond Santa Fe, Kearny decided to send 200 dragoons, artillery and the wagon train back, continuing with a smaller mounted detachment and pack mules. This was a command decision shaped directly by terrain and supply. It increased speed and flexibility, but it also admitted that the original plan could not simply be extended unchanged across the next landscape. That moment is worth lingering over because it reveals how command decisions often arrived after the road had already begun imposing its lesson. The map had not changed. The objective had not changed. But the physical reality of proceeding west forced the expedition to shed weight. Wagons that were useful in one stage became liabilities in another. Artillery that symbolized strength became too expensive to haul onward. Soldiers who had started inside a larger force continued in a reduced column, more mobile but also more exposed to the consequences of scarcity. A commander in desert war was repeatedly forced to choose between carrying more and moving faster, between retaining strength and preserving reach. None of those choices could be made without cost. Philip St. George Cook's leadership of the Mormon Battalion made this problem even more concrete. Cook was assigned to take the battalion from Santa Fe toward California and, in doing so, open a wagon road to the Pacific. National Park Service research notes that Cook followed the Camino Real south from Santa Fe before turning west into Arizona. The route would become historically important as part of a southern wagon corridor, but for the soldiers making it, importance did not make it easy. They were not travelling over a finished military road, they were helping create one while marching. The challenge was not merely to arrive. It was to prove that wheeled transport could pass through the country at all. That meant every decision about direction, pace and route carried special weight. A minor error in choosing a pass, a water source, or an alignment through difficult ground could cost the battalion hours of labour. Those hours consumed strength and provisions. The soldiers sometimes had to help wagons through sand and broken terrain, and the march became one of the great tests of endurance in the war. Later observers could praise Cook's wagon road for its future significance. The men on the route first experienced it as a sequence of obstacles that had to be solved physically, with muscles, tools and patience. The map of the future was being written through present hardship. There is a tendency to think of bad maps as documents full of obvious mistakes, rivers drawn in the wrong places, mountains where no mountains stand, distances wildly false. Sometimes that happened in history. But in these campaigns, the more common problem was subtler. The available geographic information was often too thin for the demands placed upon it. A broad route might be known. The exact difficulty of using it with wagons might not be. A trail might lead successfully through a region, but only for people travelling lightly and with local knowledge. A commander could possess a useful sketch or second-hand account and still be unprepared for what happened when hundreds of men, animals and carts attempted the same crossing. In desert marching, incomplete knowledge could function almost like misinformation, because it invited confidence that the ground later refused to honour. Santa Anna's movement toward Buena Vista shows another side of this cruel arithmetic. His decision to march north and strike Zachary Taylor's smaller army made sense strategically. Taylor's forces had been weakened by troop transfers to Winfield Scott's campaign, and Santa Anna saw an opportunity. But the route north from San Luis Potosí demanded enormous effort from his army. Official army history records that his troops marched nearly 500 miles in 40 days over grueling terrain, suffered hunger, disease, desertion, and battlefield losses, and were badly worn by the time the campaign had run its course. The last 50 miles before Buena Vista crossed waterless desert, and the army arrived already physically taxed. This was not simply a failure of one map or one wrong turn. It was the consequence of asking a large army to move rapidly across a landscape that penalised rapidity. Santa Anna's officers could calculate distance, they could estimate march days, they could issue rations, set departure times, and threaten stragglers. But distance in the desert had a way of enlarging itself through scarcity. 20 miles on paper became 20 miles plus the time spent waiting for wagons, plus the weakness caused by inadequate food, plus the slowdowns from exhausted men, plus the punishment of traversing barren stretches where the army could not replenish itself. The command decision remained the same. The real cost of it expanded beneath the soldiers' feet. One of the most striking examples came from the logistical consequences of previous orders. Santa Anna had earlier ordered wells destroyed to impede American movement, but his own army later had to march through the same dry country. The decision had tactical logic when made. Deny the invader water, slow him, make the road less useful. Yet war often forces armies to revisit the ground they have already altered, and when Santa Anna's troops moved north, the absent wells contributed to their misery. A plan aimed at the enemy had become a hardship for his own men. That is not a small irony. It is a reminder that command decisions in desert country can echo longer than commanders expect. There is also the question of timing. Kearny was expected to complete his westward movement before winter became an obstacle in the mountains. Santa Anna sought to exploit Taylor's exposed position before events changed. Military opportunity often has a clock attached to it. Commanders feel that clock constantly. Delay can mean losing the enemy, surrendering initiative, or allowing reinforcements to arrive. But the desert has its own clock. Water consumption, daylight, animal strength, seasonal conditions, and the recovery time of exhausted men all impose a schedule that does not care about political urgency. When military timing and environmental timing conflict, soldiers become the point of collision. This is why forced marches deserve such careful attention. A forced march is not simply a march conducted briskly. It's a decision to draw on the body's reserve in the hope that speed will produce an advantage worth the cost. Santa Anna used hard marching in his approach to Buena Vista. Doniphan's men, in another theatre of the war, also made astonishingly rapid movements across difficult ground. Commanders sometimes judged correctly that speed mattered, but every forced march carried a hidden ledger. The men would arrive with less strength. The animals would arrive more worn. The sick list might grow later. The margin for error in the next operation would be smaller. Speed could create tactical surprise while simultaneously producing physical depletion. The same decision could be smart and dangerous at once. Maps struggle to express this. They could show distance between points. They could mark rivers, settlements, mountain ranges, sometimes trails. They could not easily show the exact difference between a mile crossed at dawn and a mile crossed at 2 in the afternoon after 10 earlier miles had already been spent. They could not indicate the mental drain of seeing the next rise again and again. They could not represent how a water source sufficient for 10 riders becomes inadequate for an army. They could not explain that a wagon road newly opened by Cook's battalion had first been carved through difficulty rather than inherited as convenience. Commanders needed maps, and the topographical engineers improved them enormously. But maps remained only one layer of knowledge. The desert kept the final authority. That limitation did not mean commanders were blind. Many understood the environment quite well and adjusted intelligently. Taylor repositioned at Buena Vista where terrain offered a better defensive posture. Kearny chose water security over a shorter route early in his campaign. Cook adapted an expedition into a road-opening mission through brutal country. The topographical engineers surveyed, reconnoitred, and turned scattered observation into military knowledge that would prove valuable beyond the war itself. These examples matter because they prevent an easy story in which officers are merely reckless and soldiers merely victims. The truth is more unsettling. Even capable officers making serious decisions could still ask too much of men when operating through a land that punished miscalculation so severely. The cruel arithmetic of distance becomes clearest when you imagine it from the perspective of a private in the ranks. He does not see the full map. He hears that the column will make another 18 miles. Perhaps that number means little at first. 18 miles sounds finite, it can be counted. But by midday, he understands the number differently. It means 18 miles with a canteen he is trying not to empty too quickly. 18 miles while one man near him coughs continuously. 18 miles behind wagons that stall where the ground softens. 18 miles with the animal team slowing. 18 miles that may become 20 if the guide chooses a wider bend, or if the camp selected in the morning proves unsuitable by evening. The commander gave a number. The soldier experienced a condition. And sometimes, the men knew before the officers said anything that the calculation had gone wrong. Rumours spread quickly in a marching force. The next water was farther than expected. The scouts had not found what they hoped. The wagons were behind. The animals were failing. No one needed to deliver a formal briefing. Soldiers read the mood of teamsters, the urgency of officers, the length of halts, and the way rations were handled in camp. When plans worked, discipline felt like organisation. When plans faltered, discipline could begin to feel like insistence in the face of obvious danger. Desert marching tested trust between command and rank more subtly than battle did. Men might obey an order while privately concluding that someone above them had misjudged the road. This is another reason distances mattered so much. An army might survive one unexpectedly hard day. It might even survive two. But if commanders repeatedly underestimated what the terrain required, the whole force began to age quickly. Boots wore faster. Animals lost condition. Wagons required more repair. The sick list lengthened. Food stocks shrank. Commanders then faced later decisions with fewer options, because earlier decisions had already spent the army's reserve. A march was cumulative. No day existed entirely by itself. The arithmetic of distance extended backward and forward through the campaign. A mistake today could appear tomorrow as a hungry camp, a late arrival, a weakened line, or a battle entered with less vigour than the situation demanded. The Western campaigns also show how reconnaissance itself became a form of survival. Topographical engineers were not merely map makers in the decorative sense. They helped determine routes, chart little-known terrain, and provide geographical intelligence that commanders could use in real time. Their work reduced uncertainty, but it also demonstrates how much uncertainty existed. When a military institution must send specialists ahead to learn where it can move, that tells us the environment is not simply background. It is one of the central problems of the campaign. In that sense, the engineers were fighting a war against ignorance, as surely as infantry fought a war against armed resistance. Still, reconnaissance could not remove every unknown. A guide might know the route, but not the needs of a large army. A map might show a crossing, but not whether recent weather had altered it. A commander might receive accurate information and still choose a harsh path because strategy demanded it. Santa Anna's movement toward Buena Vista was not undertaken because he believed the road pleasant. He accepted the cost in pursuit of a military opportunity. Kearny's Western March was not launched because Polk's administration thought the trail easy. It was launched because national policy demanded speed and reach across enormous territory. The tragedy is that once such high-level decisions entered desert geography, their cost was paid most directly by men who had little voice in them. There is a common way of imagining commanders as if they stand above hardship, moving pieces across a board. In reality, they were constrained by the same landscapes as everyone else, but their errors reached farther. A private who misjudged his water might endanger himself. A general who misjudged a route might endanger 10,000. That difference in scale is why command decisions matter so much in the history of desert marches. Good choices saved strength. Poor ones multiplied suffering. Incomplete information could be nearly as dangerous as recklessness. the land did not forgive either very quickly. By the later stages of these campaigns, many officers had learned lessons that were painfully practical. Do not confuse a trail with a road. Do not assume a shorter route is better. Do not count distance without counting water. Do not move wagons where pack animals are the better answer. Do not expect hungry men to maintain the same pace as well-fed ones. Do not interpret a line on a map as a promise from the terrain. The topographical engineers emerged from the war with new maps, route knowledge, and a deeper institutional understanding of how geography could determine military success. But every one of those lessons had been purchased in advance by marches where men became the test subjects of imperfect knowledge. And that brings us close to the final question. When the war ended, the desert routes remained. The wagon roads, trail corridors, and maps created during the conflict shaped later migration, commerce, and expansion across the southwest. But the soldiers who first crossed them under military orders remembered a harsher truth. The desert had not simply been crossed. It had taken payment. It took strength from Kearny's men, health from volunteers in New Mexico, endurance from the Mormon battalion, and thousands of lives and bodies from Santa Anna's battered army. It exposed the weaknesses of logistics, the limits of command judgment, and the danger of treating distance as a number instead of a lived ordeal. The war moved through those spaces, but those spaces also moved through the war, shaping who arrived, who faltered, and what victory cost before the battle lines were even drawn. And perhaps that is the clearest way to understand what the desert took from the Mexican-American War. It did not merely inconvenience the armies that crossed it. It entered the war itself. It shaped who arrived strong and who arrived weakened. It shaped how fast commanders could move, how far wagons could go, whether animals survived long enough to haul the next load, whether men reached battle with enough strength left to fight properly, and whether victories on paper concealed enormous damage underneath. The desert did not command armies, but it altered their choices. It did not sign treaties, but it helped determine the condition in which men enforced them. It did not wear a uniform, yet its presence can be felt across the Western campaigns almost as clearly as that of any general. When people remember the Mexican-American War, they often remember it as a war of rapid American advances. Zachary Taylor pushing into northern Mexico, Winfield Scott landing at Veracruz and moving toward Mexico City, Kearny entering Santa Fe without a major battle, California passing into American control. These things happened, and they mattered. But if you stay only with the grand outcomes, you miss the cost hidden in the movement itself. The war stretched across enormous distances, and in the Southwest especially, success depended on forcing military systems through land that could barely sustain them. The Army of the West followed the Santa Fe Trail, occupied New Mexico, and then continued toward California. But each of those accomplishments rested on marches that weakened men long before the celebrated objective appeared. The desert took time first. It made every distance longer than the map suggested. A route may have measured 800 miles or 900 miles in a report, but the body experienced that distance differently. It experienced the absence of water between known stops. It experienced the delay of wagons trapped by bad ground. It experienced the worry that horses and mules would not keep pulling. It experienced the morning when the boots were still damp from sweat, and the feet inside them had not recovered from yesterday. In that sense, the desert stretched time. A single day of travel felt larger than it should. A week seemed to consume more strength than a week elsewhere. Campaign planners counted days. Soldiers counted how many more mornings they could rise and do it again. It took speed too, or else demanded that speed be purchased at a terrible price. Kearny's movement into New Mexico depended on deliberate route choices, including following a trail that offered better access to water rather than simply choosing the shortest path. Later, once he pushed west toward California, the conditions became harsh enough that he reduced his force and abandoned the heavy wagon train in favour of a lighter-mounted detachment with pack animals. That was not a minor adjustment. It was an admission that military ambition had collided with geography. The army could continue, but only by changing its shape. The desert had forced a strategic redesign of the march. The Mormon battalion learned another version of the same lesson. Its march toward California, ordered in the context of Kearny's Western campaign, became one of the most punishing overland movements of the war. The battalion helped open a wagon road through the southwest, a route that later became historically significant for Western migration and transport. But that later importance should not soften what it required at the time. Men dragged wagons through difficult ground, endured short rations, suffered sickness, and watched detachments of the ill peel away from the main body. What later generations called a road began as an ordeal. It existed because soldiers and animals were made to force a passage through country that offered very little assistance. The desert took numbers from the ranks, but not always in ways that battle reports emphasized. The Mexican-American War as a whole killed far more American soldiers by disease than by direct combat. Army medical history records that more than 1,500 US soldiers were killed in action, while more than 10,000 died of disease. Those figures belong to the war broadly, not only to desert marches, but the Western campaigns help us understand why the body became so vulnerable. Exhaustion, contaminated water, poor shelter, deficient food, crowding, heat, cold, and long-distance movement all created conditions in which disease flourished. The desert did not cause every fever or intestinal illness, but it made recovery harder and weakness more common. That distinction matters. A soldier who dies in battle is recognized immediately as a casualty of war. A soldier who sickens after a march, declines in a crowded hospital, and dies without having seen the enemy is sometimes remembered less clearly. But his death belongs to the war just as much. Kearny's men became sick and exhausted on the long route towards Santa Fe. Doniphan's volunteers suffered heavily from illness during their movements in the Western Theatre. Santa Fe's hospitals filled with men weakened by campaign conditions. The Mormon battalion shed sick detachments because some bodies could no longer bear the demands of the march. These losses did not occur outside the war. They were one of the ways the war functioned. The desert also took certainty from commanders. It turned confident plans into risky estimates. Santa Anna's advance toward Buena Vista remains one of the clearest examples. He moved a large Mexican army north through punishing conditions in the hope of striking Taylor's exposed force. The maneuver had logic, and it nearly produced a major strategic result. But the cost of reaching that battlefield was enormous. His army marched hundreds of miles across difficult country, struggled with inadequate wagons and starvation rations, and crossed a final waterless stretch before battle. By the time the troops stood against Taylor, they had already paid heavily in fatigue, hunger, and physical deterioration. After the fighting, shortages of food and water helped limit what Santa Anna could still attempt. The desert had not defeated him alone, but it had narrowed his possibilities. This is one reason the war's western and northern campaigns deserve to be remembered with more attention to movement. They show that an army can win ground while losing strength. Kearny reached Santa Fe without a battle, which sounds effortless when reduced to a sentence. Santa Anna reached Buena Vista after a severe march, which can sound like a prelude rather than an event in itself. The Mormon battalion reached California, which can sound like a line on a timeline. But behind each achievement was a body count of a different kind, one measured in men loaded into wagons, animals left behind, rations shrinking, sick detachments formed, and commands arriving less capable than they had been when they set out. The desert took comfort from the war too, and comfort matters more than military histories often allow. It took the ordinary reassurance of dependable water. It took the ease of sleeping deeply after labour. It took the simple expectation that food would arrive in enough quantity to feel like a meal. It took the ability to trust that distance meant what people said it meant. A mile in dry country with weak animals and uncertain supply is not the same as a mile along a well-supported road. Soldiers learned this through repetition. They learned that maps were helpful but not merciful. They learned that a route could be known and still be cruel. They learned that army discipline could keep a column moving, but not make the climate kinder. It took dignity from many men as well, not because they lacked courage, but because hunger, thirst, and disease reduce human beings to needs that are difficult to romanticize. A soldier can imagine himself brave in battle. It is harder to imagine himself staggering toward a muddy water source, begging for a place on a wagon, or sitting beside a trail because his legs will not carry him farther. These are not scenes often painted on patriotic canvases, yet they are closer to the lived truth of many marches than bayonets gleaming in the sun. The desert exposed the body beneath the uniform. It reminded men that no amount of ceremony could cancel thirst, no martial song could replace calories, and no command voice could order a fever away. There is another thing the desert took that is harder to measure. It took away the illusion that war unfolds mainly where armies meet. The Mexican-American War did have great confrontations. It had Palo Alto, Monterrey, Buena Vista, Cerro Gordo, Churubusco, Chapultepec. But Western campaigning teaches us that war also happens in the interval. It happens between places. It happens on the road that leads to the battlefield, in the camp that follows a brutal march, in the rear where hospitals fill, and in the headquarters where officers realise their supplies will not stretch as far as expected. The desert enlarged that interval until it became one of the central facts of the conflict. At the same time, the desert gave later generations routes they would continue to use. The Santa Fe Trail became even more important after the war, serving as a national road connecting the United States to the newly acquired Southwest. The Mormon Battalion's route contributed to later wagon travel across the southern corridor toward California. Military surveying during the war strengthened American geographic knowledge of the West, and the work of topographical engineers helped transform regions of uncertainty into mapped routes of future movement. This is part of the uncomfortable legacy. Hardships suffered by soldiers during wartime became information and infrastructure used by others afterward. The trails did not remember who collapsed beside them, but later travellers benefited from paths that earlier feet had tested, and this raises a larger question about conquest itself. The Mexican-American War ended with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and massive territorial changes in North America. The United States gained vast lands in the West and Southwest. Maps shifted. Borders shifted. Political futures shifted. But before those new lines hardened into national memory, men had to cross the actual ground. They had to move through New Mexico, across desert routes, through mountain passes, along river corridors, and into California. The treaty was signed in rooms. The territory was reached by bodies. The desert reminds us of that difference. The Mexican side carried its own losses into that ending. Santa Anna's northward campaign showed how terribly a large army could be drained before and after battle by logistics and environment. Mexican soldiers marched under severe conditions, fought at Buena Vista, and then retreated with their force further weakened by want. The country they defended had demanded much of them before the Americans ever fired on them in that engagement. Their suffering belongs in this history just as surely as the suffering of the US columns moving west. The desert did not distinguish between invader and defender. It simply exacted its price from whoever crossed it with too many men and too few resources. When I think about these marches, I keep coming back to how often the decisive thing was not drama, but depletion. Not a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual lessening. Less water in the canteen, less feed for the animals, less food in the wagon, less certainty in the guide's estimate, less strength in the stride, less room for the sick, less patience in the camp, less margin in every decision. The desert did not need to destroy an army in one stroke, it only needed to keep reducing it. By the time some forces reached their destination, they had been diminished in ways no simple march table could fully express. There is a temptation, when looking back on history, to admire endurance so much that we forget to grieve what endurance cost. Yes, men crossed extraordinary distances. Yes, armies accomplished objectives that seemed nearly impossible. Yes, routes opened in wartime helped shape the later geography of the American West. But that cannot be the only thing we take from the story. We should also notice the nameless soldier who never reached the battlefield, the team animal that collapsed in harness, the sick volunteer who was detached from the march and watched his comrades disappear down the road, the Mexican infantryman who arrived near Buena Vista already half spent by hunger and distance. History does not become weaker when we remember them. It becomes truer. Maybe that is why desert marches stay with us once we begin paying attention to them. They strip war down to its most basic requirements. People must eat. They must drink. They must sleep. Animals must be fed. Wheels must turn. Roads must exist or be made. Intelligence must be good enough. Command must not ask more than the body can bear too often, though in war it frequently does. The Mexican-American War is often studied through its diplomacy, its battles, and its consequences for the United States and Mexico. It should also be studied through the march, because the march reveals the hidden machinery of victory and the hidden suffering buried underneath it. So the next time you see a campaign map with a clean arrow crossing the southwest, pause over that arrow for a moment. Imagine what it conceals. Imagine the dust hanging behind the wagons. Imagine a man holding the last warm mouthful from his canteen because he does not know how long until the next spring. Imagine a horse standing with its head lowered, too tired to respond quickly to the reins. Imagine a surgeon writing down another name in a place where no battle has been fought. Imagine the road continuing anyway, because orders remain orders and distance still has to be crossed. That is what the desert took from the Mexican-American War. It took strength before battle, lives without glory, certainty from commanders, and comfort from everyone who moved through it. It left behind roads, maps, and hard lessons, but it demanded payment first.